She came to marry a stranger, but when she stepped off that train into the Wyoming dust, the man who promised to be there had vanished like smoke. What happened next would change 3 broken lives forever. A desperate woman with nowhere to go, a grieving boy who saw his dead mother's face in a stranger, and a cowboy father who'd sworn never to trust again. This is the story of Maribel Hayes, the mail-order bride who arrived unwanted and became the heart of a family who would die to protect her. Stay until the end and comment what city you're watching from so I can see how far this story traveled. The train's whistle cut through the afternoon heat like a knife through butter, long and mournful, echoing across the endless expanse of Wyoming grassland. Maribel Hayes pressed her gloved hand against the soot-stained window, watching the world outside slow from a blur into distinct shapes: weathered fence posts, scattered cattle, a hawk circling overhead. Her heart hammered against her ribs, each beat a mixture of hope and terror that had become sickeningly familiar over the past 3 days of travel. The conductor's voice boomed through the passenger car. "Red Butte Station! Red Butte! 5 minutes stop!" 5 minutes. That's all it would take for her entire life to change. Again. Maribel smoothed the wrinkles from her traveling dress, a modest gray cotton that had seen better days but was the finest thing she owned. The fabric was dusty from the journey, and she knew her face probably bore traces of ash from the locomotive. But there was nothing to be done about it now. She reached for the small mirror in her reticule, then stopped herself. What did it matter how she looked? Miles Dandridge had already agreed to marry her based on a single photograph taken 3 years ago when she still had some light in her eyes. A man who would take a mail-order bride wasn't looking for beauty. He was looking for something else: labor, companionship, or perhaps just someone to cook his meals and darn his socks. The thought should have depressed her, but Maribel had learned long ago that depression was a luxury she couldn't afford. The train jerked and shuddered as the brakes engaged, throwing her forward slightly. She grabbed the seat in front of her to steady herself, earning a disapproving look from the elderly woman across the aisle who'd been praying her rosary beads for the past 100 miles. Maribel offered an apologetic smile that wasn't returned. She was used to that, too. Through the window, Red Butte Station materialized like a mirage. It wasn't much. A simple wooden platform with a faded sign, a small ticket office with peeling paint, and beyond it, the dusty main street of a town that looked like it was barely holding on to existence. A handful of buildings lined the thoroughfare: a mercantile, a saloon with a crooked sign, what might have been a church or a schoolhouse, and several structures whose purposes she couldn't immediately determine. Horses were tied to hitching posts, and a few wagons stood waiting in the shade. And somewhere in that cluster of weathered wood and desperate hope was the man she was supposed to marry. Miles Dandridge. She rolled the name around in her mind, trying to attach feelings to it. He'd written her exactly 4 letters over the past 3 months, each one shorter than the last. The first had been almost poetic, speaking of wide-open spaces and new beginnings, of a ranch where she could make a home and be mistress of her own domain. The subsequent letters had been increasingly practical: lists of what she should bring, instructions for the journey, a brief description of his circumstances. A modest spread, he'd called it. Nothing fancy, but honest work and honest living. Honest. The word had appealed to her. After 3 years working in Mrs. Pemberton's boarding house in Philadelphia, where the walls were thin and the tenants' intentions were often anything but honest, the idea of an honest life had shimmered like a promised land. The train lurched to a complete stop, and steam hissed from beneath the cars, rolling across the platform in ghostly waves. Maribel's stomach clenched. This was it. The moment she'd been simultaneously dreading and praying for ever since she'd posted her reply to Miles Dandridge's advertisement in the Matrimonial Times. Widower, 42, seeks respectable woman for marriage and companionship. Must be of good character and willing to work. Ranch life. Wyoming territory. No drinkers or women of questionable morals need apply. She'd read that advertisement 100 times, memorizing every word, looking for hidden meanings between the letters. Was he kind? Was he cruel? Would he keep his promises, or was this just another version of the lies she'd been told her whole life? "Red Beauty!" the conductor called again, and passengers began to stir. Maribel reached under the seat for her suitcase, a battered leather thing held together with a strap, because one of the latches had broken in Chicago. Everything she owned in the world was in that case. 2 dresses besides the one she wore, a nightgown, undergarments, her mother's Bible, a silver hairbrush that had been her grandmother's, and the letters from Miles Dandridge, folded carefully and tied with a ribbon. Not much to show for 26 years of living, but it was hers. She stood, knees trembling slightly, and made her way toward the exit. The elderly woman with the rosary beads looked up as she passed. "Going to meet your husband?" the woman asked, her voice carrying a note of judgment that made it clear she'd guessed Maribel's purpose. "Yes, ma'am," Maribel replied, keeping her voice steady. "Huh." The woman's mouth puckered like she'd bitten into a lemon. "These modern arrangements. In my day, we married men we knew, men from our own communities." Maribel could have pointed out that not everyone had the luxury of communities or courtships, that some of us had to make do with what opportunities presented themselves. But she'd learned long ago that defending yourself to people who'd already condemned you was a waste of breath. "Have a pleasant journey, ma'am," she said instead, and moved past. The space between the rail cars was brutally hot. The metal steps slicked from the steam. Maribel gripped the handrail tightly as she descended, her free hand clutching her suitcase. The platform was rough wood, splintered and uneven, and the heat radiating from it hit her like a physical force. Philadelphia in July had been sweltering, but this was different. A dry, relentless heat that seemed to pull the moisture right out of your body. She stepped fully onto the platform and looked around, searching for a man who matched the description in Miles Dandridge's letters. Tall, dark-haired, usually wearing a brown leather vest. That described about half the men in Wyoming, she suspected. But surely he'd be watching for the train, waiting for her. The platform wasn't crowded, but there were enough people to make her search difficult. A family was reuniting near the ticket office, a young woman throwing herself into the arms of a man who spun her around, both of them laughing. An older gentleman in a suit was collecting several trunks, directing a porter with sharp, precise gestures. A group of cowboys stood near the edge of the platform, smoking and talking in low voices, their eyes following her with the kind of lazy interest men always showed when a new woman arrived in a small town. But no one approached her. No one stepped forward with a smile of recognition or a word of greeting. Maribel's heart sank a little further with each passing second. The train hissed behind her, preparing to depart. Other passengers were disembarking now, moving past her with purpose, knowing where they were going and who would be waiting. She stood frozen in the middle of the platform, an island in a stream, and felt the first cold fingers of panic begin to squeeze her chest. Where was he? "Can I help you, miss?" She turned to find a young man in a conductor's uniform regarding her with polite curiosity. He couldn't have been more than 19, with a sparse mustache he was probably very proud of. I'm supposed to be meeting someone," Maribel said, hating how uncertain her voice sounded. "Mr. Miles Dandridge? Do you know him?" The conductor's face brightened with recognition. "Oh, sure. Mr. Dandridge. He's got a place about 15 miles east of here." Then his expression clouded slightly. "Though I don't see him here at the moment. You certain he knew you were arriving today?" "I sent a telegram last week confirming my arrival," Maribel said, and now the panic wasn't just touching her. It was wrapping around her throat like a noose. "He should be here." "Well, maybe he got held up. Ranch life, you know. Always something demanding attention. I'm sure he'll be along shortly." The conductor smiled reassuringly, but there was a flicker of doubt in his eyes that told Maribel he wasn't as confident as he pretended. "You can wait in the station office if you like. Mrs. Garrett, who runs the ticket counter, will make you a cup of tea." "Thank you," Maribel managed, but she didn't move toward the office. Something felt wrong. A man who was expecting his bride to arrive, a bride who'd traveled 1,000 miles to marry him, that man wouldn't be late. That man would have been waiting on the platform an hour early, watching every passenger car, making sure he didn't miss her. Unless he'd changed his mind. The thought crashed over her like ice water. Oh God, what if he'd changed his mind? What if he'd received her final letter, the one where she'd been honest about her lack of dowry, about having to borrow money for the train fare, about having no family to vouch for her character, and decided she wasn't worth the trouble? What would she do then? She had $17 to her name, not enough to get back to Philadelphia, even if she wanted to return to that city of broken promises, not enough to start over anywhere else. The train's whistle blew again, a warning that it would be departing shortly. Maribel watched as the last passengers boarded, the conductor swinging up onto the steps with practiced ease. Within minutes, the locomotive would pull away, taking with it her last connection to the world she'd known, leaving her stranded in this dusty Wyoming town with no husband, no prospects, and nowhere to go. She felt dizzy suddenly, the heat and the fear and the exhaustion from 3 days of travel all catching up to her at once. She set down her suitcase and pressed a hand to her forehead, trying to steady her breathing, trying not to let the panic win. "You all right there, miss?" A different voice this time, gruff but not unkind. She looked up to find one of the cowboys had approached, a man in his 50s with a weathered face and kind eyes. He'd removed his hat and was holding it against his chest in a gesture of respect that surprised her. "I'm fine," she said automatically, then immediately regretted the lie. She wasn't fine. Nothing about this was fine. "Actually, I'm supposed to meet Miles Dandridge, but he doesn't seem to be here." The cowboy's expression shifted, something she couldn't quite read passing across his features. "Miles Dandridge, you say?" "Yes. Do you know him? Do you know where I might find him?" Before the man could answer, a commotion erupted near the edge of the platform. Voices rose in alarm and people scattered. Maribel turned, confused, trying to see what was happening. Through the dissipating steam and the milling crowd, she caught a glimpse of movement, something small and fast, darting between adults, heading straight toward her. A child. A boy. No more than 7 or 8 years old, with dark hair sticking up in cowlicks and dust streaked across his tear-stained face. He was running full tilt, his boots pounding against the wooden planks, and there was something wild in his eyes, something desperate and hopeful and terrified all at once. Behind him, a tall man in dusty work clothes was giving chase, calling out, "Eli! Eli! Stop! Come back here!" But the boy didn't stop. He ran directly toward Maribel, weaving between startled onlookers, his eyes locked on her face with an intensity that was almost frightening. She took an instinctive step back, uncertain, her hand going to her throat. The boy reached her and didn't slow down. He crashed into her skirts, his small arms wrapping around her waist, his face pressing against the fabric of her dress. She stumbled backward, barely maintaining her balance, shocked by the sudden impact. And then the boy looked up at her, and Maribel's breath caught in her chest. His eyes were the color of storm clouds, gray-blue and swimming with tears. His face was thin, almost gaunt, with sharp cheekbones that spoke of too many meals missed or too much grief carried. But it was the expression in those eyes that broke her heart. Such naked hope, such desperate need, such aching loneliness. "Mama?" His voice cracked on the word, small and trembling and full of impossible longing. "Mama, are you finally here? Did you come back?" The platform had gone silent. Every eye was on them now. The strange woman from the train and the grieving boy who'd mistaken her for someone else. Someone lost. Maribel felt the weight of those stares, felt the collective breath being held, waiting to see what she would do. Her hands hovered over the boy's head, uncertain. She should correct him. She should gently explain that she wasn't his mother, that there'd been a mistake, that she was a stranger who'd just arrived in town and had problems of her own. But she couldn't make the words come. The boy, Eli, the man had called him, was shaking now, trembling like a leaf in a storm, and his grip on her dress was so tight his knuckles had gone white. She could feel him struggling not to sob, could hear the hitching breaths he was taking, could sense the monumental effort it was costing him to hold himself together. Without thinking, without planning, operating purely on instinct, Maribel knelt down. The rough wood of the platform bit into her knees through her dress, but she barely noticed. She brought herself to eye level with the boy, and slowly, carefully, she placed her hands on his thin shoulders. "Sweetheart," she said softly, and the word surprised her. She hadn't used endearments in years, hadn't had anyone to use them with. "Sweetheart, I think there's been a mistake." "No." The boy's voice rose, panicked. "No, you look just like her, just like the picture Papa keeps. You have the same eyes, the same hair. It's you, isn't it? You came back?" Before Maribel could respond, the tall man who'd been chasing the boy finally caught up. He was breathing hard, his face flushed beneath several days' worth of dark beard stubble. He wore dusty work clothes, worn denim and a faded blue shirt, and his hat had fallen off during the chase, revealing dark hair shot through with premature gray. "Eli, I'm so sorry," he said, reaching for the boy's shoulder. His voice was rough, strained with embarrassment and what sounded like pain. "Come on, son. This isn't... She's not... She is." Eli twisted away from his father's hand, pressing closer to Maribel. "Papa, look at her. Really look. It's Mama." The tall man's eyes finally met Maribel's, and she saw something flicker in their depth. Shock, perhaps, or recognition, or maybe just bone-deep exhaustion. They were dark-eyed, nearly black in the afternoon sun, set in a face that was hard and weathered but might have been handsome once, before grief carved lines around his mouth and shadows beneath his eyes. For a moment, they simply stared at each other, and Maribel felt something pass between them, a current of understanding, of shared sorrow, of two people who'd both learned that life doesn't give you what you hope for, only what you can survive. "I apologize for my son," the man said, his voice carefully controlled now, formal. "He lost his mother last winter. Sometimes he still looks for her." "I'm not looking for her," Eli protested, his voice breaking. "I found her. Papa, why can't you see? It's really her." Maribel's heart cracked. She'd never had children, had never been married, had never even had a serious courtship, but something in her responded to this boy's grief with a force that surprised her. Maybe it was because she understood what it meant to lose people, to be left behind, to keep hoping against hope that somehow the people you'd lost would come back. She kept her hands on his shoulders, steady and warm, and spoke directly to him. "What's your name, sweetheart?" "Eli," he whispered. "Eli Turner." "Eli, that's a strong name. I'm Maribel Hay." She paused, choosing her next words carefully. "I just arrived on the train from Philadelphia. I've never been to Wyoming before today. I've never met your mama." She watched his face as comprehension slowly broke through the desperate hope. His expression crumpled, tears finally spilling over, tracking through the dust on his cheeks. "But you look so much like her," he said, his voice barely audible. I really thought... "I know," Maribel said gently. "I know what it's like to hope for something so hard it feels real." The man, Eli's father, reached for his son again, and this time Eli didn't resist. But as he was pulled back, the boy kept his eyes fixed on Maribel's face, and she saw the hope wasn't entirely gone. It had just been wounded, pushed down, forced back into whatever corner of his heart where he kept all his wishes for impossible things. "Again, I apologize," Eli's father said, settling his hands on the boy's shoulders. This isn't how we usually greet strangers." "No apology necessary," Maribel assured him, rising to her feet. Her knees protested, but she ignored them. "Grief makes us all do unexpected things." The man studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. "You said you just arrived. Are you being met by someone?" And there it was, the question she'd been dreading, the one that would expose her situation and her foolishness for all the town to see. She could lie. She could claim she was visiting relatives, or that her husband was waiting for her at the hotel, or any number of false stories that would preserve her dignity. But Maribel had learned that lies always caught up with you eventually, usually at the worst possible moment. And besides, she was too tired to lie convincingly. "I was supposed to be met," she said, keeping her voice level. "But it seems my intended didn't receive my telegram. Or perhaps..." She let the sentence trail off, unable to finish it. Perhaps he changed his mind. Perhaps he was never serious about the arrangement. Perhaps I've been played for a fool. Understanding dawned in the man's eyes, followed by something that looked like sympathy. Mail-order bride? The words stung, even though they were true. There was always a stigma attached to women who advertised for husbands. A suggestion of desperation or damaged goods or some fatal flaw that made them unmarriageable through normal channels. "Yes," she said, lifting her chin defiantly. "I'm supposed to marry Miles Dandridge." The reaction was immediate and impossible to miss. The man's expression hardened. Eli's eyes went wide. And from the crowd of onlookers who were still watching this drama unfold, Maribel heard a collective intake of breath that spoke volumes. "Miles Dandridge," the man repeated slowly, and his voice had gone cold. "You're here to marry Miles Dandridge." That was the arrangement, yes. Maribel's heart was racing now. Something was wrong, very wrong. "Do you know him? Do you know where I might find him?" The man opened his mouth, then closed it again. He looked at his son, then back at Maribel, and she saw him making some kind of calculation, weighing options she couldn't see. "I'm Caleb Turner," he said finally. "I have the ranch adjacent to Dandridge's property, and I think there are some things you need to know about the man who traveled all this way to marry." The way he said it, the careful tone, the deliberate choice of words, sent ice water through Maribel's veins. She'd known, in some corner of her heart, that this situation wasn't right. The missing groom, the shocked reactions, the way Caleb Turner was looking at her now with a mixture of pity and something else, anger, maybe, or protectiveness. "Tell me," she said, and she was proud that her voice didn't shake. "Whatever it is, just tell me." Caleb glanced around at the crowd that had gathered, faces she didn't know, people who would carry whatever happened next through the town like wildfire. He seemed to make a decision. "Not here," he said. "My wagon's just down the street. Let me take you somewhere we can talk properly, somewhere you can sit down and have some water before we discuss your situation." "I don't need to sit down," Maribel protested. "I need to know what's happened. Where's Miles Dandridge? Why isn't he here?" "Because he's a lying, cheating, no good us." Caleb cut himself off, glancing at his son. "Because he isn't the man he pretended to be in his letters. And because if I had to guess, he's probably already collected whatever dowry you were supposed to bring and is halfway to Denver by now." The platform tilted beneath Maribel's feet. She heard the words, understood them individually, but her brain refused to assemble them into a coherent meaning. Collected her dowry? But she didn't have a dowry. She'd been very clear about that in her letters. "I don't understand," she said faintly. "He's done this before," Caleb continued, his voice grim. "Advertised for a bride, gotten some money sent ahead, then disappeared before the woman arrived. He preys on women who are desperate enough to take a chance on a stranger." The words hit Maribel like physical blows. Desperate. That's what she was, what she'd been. Desperate enough to board a train to Wyoming. Desperate enough to agree to marry a man she'd never met. Desperate enough to believe that someone, somewhere, might actually want her for something other than what they could take from her. "But I didn't send any money," she heard herself say, as if that mattered, as if that changed anything. "I told him I had no dowry. I was very clear about that." Caleb's expression softened slightly. "Then maybe there was some other reason he didn't show. But I'd be lying if I told you I thought it was a good reason. Miles Dandridge is not a man of honor, Miss Hayes, and I'll be straight with you. If he's left you stranded here, you're better off without him." Better off? Alone in a strange town with $17 and no prospects. Better off? The laugh that escaped Maribel's throat was bitter and sharp. Better off? I have nowhere to go. No money to get there even if I did. Everything I own is in that suitcase. She gestured to where her battered luggage sat forgotten on the platform. "So please forgive me if I don't feel particularly grateful for being abandoned." She hadn't meant to say all that, hadn't meant to let the fear and the anger and the crushing disappointment come pouring out in front of all these strangers. But 3 days of travel, of hope and dread tangled together, of imagining a future that had just been ripped away. It was too much. She was too tired to maintain the careful composure she'd spent years perfecting. Silence fell over the platform. The train had pulled away during the confrontation, leaving them all standing in the settling dust, and now there was nothing to mask the awkwardness, nothing to fill the terrible quiet, except the distant sound of horses and the wind moving through the grass beyond town. Then Eli Turner spoke, his voice small but determined. "She can stay with us." "Eli," Caleb started. "Papa, she's got nowhere to go. You said so yourself. And we've got the extra room since Mama..." He stopped, swallowing hard. "Since Mama went to heaven. It's not right to leave her alone." Maribel looked at the boy, at this small, grieving child who had mistaken her for his dead mother and was now trying to save her in return, and felt something crack open inside her chest. "That's very kind," she said softly. "But I couldn't impose..." "It's not an imposition if we're offering," Caleb interrupted. He was watching her with those dark eyes, measuring, assessing. Eli's right. We do have the room, and he paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. And it's a long ride back to my ranch, but there's a boarding house in town. Mrs. Kelly runs a respectable place. She might have a room you could rent while you figure out your next step. With what money? Maribel asked bluntly. I have $17, Mr. Turner. That might buy me a week at a boarding house if I'm lucky. And then what? I'll be exactly where I am now, except a week older and 7 days hungrier. She saw respect flash in Caleb's eyes. Respect for her honesty, maybe, or for her refusal to pretend this situation was anything other than dire. Then stay at the ranch, he said, just for a few days until we figure something out. You can help with the cooking and the housework if it makes you feel better about accepting charity. God knows the place has fallen apart since Sarah died. And Eli could use... He trailed off, looking at his son with such profound sadness that Maribel had to look away. Could use what? She asked quietly. Someone who isn't drowning in their own grief, Caleb finished. Someone who might remember how to smile. The honesty of it stole her breath. This man she'd just met was laying his soul bare on a train platform in front of half the town, admitting his failures as a father, offering help to a stranger because his dead wife's absence had left a hole in his life he didn't know how to fill. I'm not particularly good at smiling these days either, Maribel admitted. Then maybe you can both learn again, Caleb suggested. Or maybe you'll just be miserable together for a few days until you move on. Either way, you'll have a roof over your head and 3 meals a day, which is better than you've got right now. It was an impossibly generous offer from a man who had no reason to trust her, and every reason to send her on her way. Maribel knew she should refuse, knew that accepting charity from a widower she'd just met was inviting gossip and complications, knew that letting herself get tangled up in someone else's grief when she was barely holding herself together was a terrible idea. But she also knew that refusing meant facing a night alone in a strange town with no plan and dwindling resources, meant admitting defeat before she'd even tried to find a way forward, meant giving up the one thing she'd held on to through 3 years in Philadelphia's worst boarding house, the belief that she deserved better than whatever scraps life threw at her. All right, she heard herself say, just for a few days, until I can find work or figure out some other option. Eli's face lit up like sunrise, and Caleb nodded, something like relief crossing his features. Good, he said. That's settled then. My wagon's at Jameson's Mercantile. Let me get your bag. He bent to pick up her suitcase, testing its weight with a slight frown. This is all you brought? I travel light, Maribel said, her voice harder than she intended. Learned a long time ago not to get too attached to things. Something in Caleb's expression shifted. Recognition, maybe, of a kindred spirit. Someone else who'd learned to let go. Fair enough, was all he said. Come on then. It's a 15-mile ride to the ranch, and I'd like to be home before dark. As they made their way off the platform and onto the dusty main street of Red Butte, Maribel was acutely aware of the stairs following them. The whispers were already starting. She could feel them like insects crawling across her skin. The mail-order bride who'd been abandoned. The desperate woman being taken in by the widower. The scandal of it all would be the talk of the town by sunset. She lifted her chin and kept walking. Eli had slipped his hand into hers without asking permission, his small fingers warm and slightly sticky against her palm. She should probably discourage it. She'd be leaving in a few days, and she didn't want him getting attached to another person who would disappear from his life. But she couldn't quite make herself pull away. His grip was gentle but insistent, and there was something comforting about it, about being needed even in this small way. The Mercantile was a rambling building with a covered porch and various tools and supplies displayed in the windows. Caleb's wagon was hitched out front, a sturdy farm wagon with a bench seat and a bed that currently held several sacks of what looked like feed or seed. It wasn't fancy, but it was well maintained, the wood solid and the wheels properly greased. Caleb loaded her suitcase into the back with the other supplies, then turned to help her up onto the seat. His hand was calloused and strong, his grip steadying her as she climbed up. Eli scrambled up between them, clearly determined to stay as close to her as possible. As Caleb settled into the driver's seat and took up the reins, Maribel allowed herself one last look at the train station. at the place where her carefully constructed plans had fallen apart. The platform was mostly empty now, the crowd dispersed, the drama over. In an hour, the train would be gone from Red Butte entirely, carrying other passengers to other destinations, other futures. But she wasn't on it. For better or worse, she was here. "Ready?" Caleb asked. Maribel nodded, not trusting her voice. The wagon lurched forward, and Red Butte Station fell away behind them. They rode in silence for a while, the only sounds the creak of the wagon wheels, the clip-clop of the horses' hooves, and the endless whisper of wind through the grass. The landscape stretched out in all directions, vast and empty in a way that would have been beautiful if Maribel hadn't been so exhausted and heartsick. The sky was enormous, a dome of blue so intense it almost hurt to look at, and the grass rolled like waves on an ocean, brown and gold in the late summer heat. "It's so empty," she said finally, unable to keep the words in. "That's what most folks say when they first get here," Caleb replied. His voice was easier now, less formal than it had been on the platform. "Give it time. You start seeing things you missed at first. The way the light changes, the patterns in the grass, the sky at sunset." He paused. "Sarah used to say Wyoming was God showing off." Beside her, Eli stiffened at the mention of his mother's name. Maribel felt him press closer against her side. "She sounds like she was a wise woman," Maribel said carefully. "She was." Caleb's hands tightened on the reins. "And kind. And patient with a man who didn't deserve her patience. She made that ranch into a home, made it feel like there was a reason to wake up every morning." His voice dropped lower. "When she died, it was like someone blew out all the lights." The grief in his voice was raw, unhealed, and Maribel understood it in her bones. She'd felt that way when her mother died, when the last person who'd loved her unconditionally was gone, and the world became a colder, harder place. "How did she die?" Maribel asked, then immediately regretted the question. "I'm sorry, you don't have to answer that. It's none of my business." "Fever," Caleb said flatly. "Last winter was brutal. She caught something, and we couldn't get her to a doctor fast enough. By the time we got her to town," he shook his head, "she was gone within 3 days. I'm so sorry." "Everyone's sorry," Caleb said, and there was a trace of bitterness in his voice now. "Sorry doesn't bring her back. Sorry doesn't make Eli stop looking for her in every woman's face. Sorry doesn't make the house feel less empty." They fell silent again, but it was a different kind of silence now, heavy with shared loss, with the understanding that some wounds never really heal, you just learn to carry them. "Your mama was pretty," Eli said suddenly, his voice startling them both. He was looking up at Maribel with those storm-gray eyes. "Do you look like your mama?" "I do," Maribel said. "Or at least, I used to when I was younger. We had the same dark hair and the same eyes. People used to say we could have been sisters instead of mother and daughter. Where is she now?" "She died when I was 17, almost 10 years ago now." "Did she have the fever too?" "No, sweetheart. Her heart just gave out one day. The doctor said it was weak, that she probably had been sick for a long time without knowing it." Eli considered this solemnly. "Do you miss her?" "Every single day." "Me too," Eli whispered. "I miss my mama every single day." Maribel looked down at the boy pressed against her side and did something she'd sworn she wouldn't do. She wrapped her arm around his thin shoulders and pulled him closer. He melted into the embrace immediately, as if he'd been waiting for permission to let someone hold him. Over Eli's head, she met Caleb's eyes. He was watching them with an expression she couldn't quite read. Surprise, maybe, or gratitude, or perhaps just the weary recognition of a man who'd been trying to be both mother and father and failing at both. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For what?" "For not pulling away. For not telling him he's too old to be held. For not..." He struggled for the words. "For not being afraid of his grief." "How could I be afraid of it?" Maribel asked. "I understand it. I've lived it." They rode on as the sun began its slow descent toward the horizon, painting the grasslands in shades of gold and amber. Maribel watched the landscape change in the shifting light and tried not to think about what she was going to do next, about how she would survive in this strange place with no prospects and no plan. For now, for this moment, She was on a wagon heading toward a ranch she'd never seen, sitting next to a man she'd just met, holding a boy who'd mistaken her for his dead mother. It wasn't the future she'd imagined when she'd boarded that train in Philadelphia. It wasn't the new beginning she'd hoped for. But it was something. It was a moment of warmth in a world that had been cold for so long. It was an arm around a grieving child and a shared understanding of loss. It was a place to sleep tonight and the promise of 3 meals tomorrow. It was, for now, enough. The Turner Ranch appeared on the horizon about an hour later, a collection of buildings huddled together against the vastness of the prairie. There was a main house, barn, several outbuildings, and corrals where horses moved lazily in the fading light. It was modest but well kept, everything in good repair despite what Caleb had said about things falling apart. As they drew closer, Maribel could see the house more clearly. It was a simple 2-story structure with a wide porch wrapping around the front and one side. The wood was weathered but solid, and curtains hung in the windows, though they looked like they hadn't been changed or washed in months. "It's not much," Caleb said, and she heard self-consciousness creep into his voice. "Nothing like what you'd be used to in Philadelphia." "Mr. Turner," Maribel said firmly, "I worked in a boarding house where 6 women shared 2 rooms and the walls were so thin you could hear everything that happened in the rooms next door. Trust me when I say that your ranch looks like a palace." Something that might have been a smile tugged at the corner of Caleb's mouth. "Well, it's not that either, but it's home. Or it was, anyway." He pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the house and set the brake. Eli immediately scrambled down, but instead of running to the house, he stayed close to the wagon, waiting for Maribel. Caleb climbed down and came around to help her, offering his hand again. This time, as she took it, Maribel noticed the calluses, the scars, the worn skin of a man who worked with his hands every day. They were honest hands, capable hands. Her feet touched the ground and she found herself standing in front of the house that would be her home for the next few days. Through the windows, she could see the shapes of furniture, the glint of lamplight on glass. Somewhere in that house was a room where Sarah Turner had died. Somewhere in those walls was the echo of laughter and love, and all the ordinary moments that make up a life. And now Maribel, a stranger, an interloper, a woman who'd come here by accident, was about to walk through those doors and disturb whatever ghosts still lingered. "Ready?" Caleb asked, and she realized she'd been standing frozen, staring at the house. "Ready," she lied, and followed him up the porch steps. The door swung open and Maribel stepped inside, leaving behind the woman who'd boarded the train in Philadelphia 3 days ago. That woman had been full of hope and fear and desperation. This woman, the one crossing the threshold of the Turner Ranch, was still all those things, but she was also something else. She was someone who'd been needed, even if only for a moment. Someone who'd been chosen, even if only out of kindness. And as Eli's small hand found hers again in the gathering darkness of the house, Maribel allowed herself to wonder if maybe, just maybe, this disaster that had brought her to Wyoming might turn out to be something else entirely. Something like a second chance. The inside of the house smelled like dust and disuse, with an underlying scent of wood smoke and something else, maybe lavender, faded and distant, like a memory that was slowly being forgotten. Maribel stood in the entryway, her eyes adjusting to the dimmer light, and took in her surroundings with the practiced assessment of someone who'd learned to evaluate living situations quickly. The front room was larger than she'd expected, with a stone fireplace dominating one wall and windows on 2 sides that would let in good light during the day. The furniture was simple but well made. A sofa with faded upholstery, 2 wooden chairs, a small table covered with newspapers, and what looked like ranch accounts. Everything was coated in a fine layer of dust, and there were dishes stacked on the side table, boots kicked off near the door. A general air of masculine disorder that spoke of men living without a woman's organizing hand. "I know it's a mess," Caleb said, and she heard embarrassment in his voice. "We've been managing, barely." "It's fine," Maribel assured him, though her fingers were already itching to start cleaning. "I've seen worse, much worse." Eli had released her hand and was standing uncertainly in the middle of the room, watching her face as if trying to gauge her reaction to his home. She smiled at him, hoping to reassure him, and saw some of the tension leave his small shoulders. "Why don't you show Miss Hayes to the spare room?" Caleb suggested to his son. Let her get settled while I tend to the horses. It's Maribel, she corrected gently. Miss Hayes makes me feel like a school teacher, which I'm definitely not. Something flickered in Caleb's expression. Amusement, maybe, or appreciation for her informality. Maribel, then. And you can call me Caleb. We don't stand much on ceremony out here. He moved past her to retrieve her suitcase from the wagon, and Maribel caught a scent of leather and hay and honest sweat, the smell of a man who worked hard and didn't apologize for it. It wasn't unpleasant, just different from the perfumed men who'd frequented Mrs. Pemberton's boarding house, the ones who masked their true natures with cologne and false charm. Eli tugged at her sleeve. The spare room's upstairs. He stopped, swallowing hard. It was supposed to be for when we had guests, but nobody ever came to visit after Mama got sick. Maribel followed the boy up a narrow staircase, each step creaking under her weight. The second floor was dark, just a hallway with 4 doors, all closed. Eli pushed open the second door on the right, revealing a small bedroom with a single bed, a dresser, and a window that looked out over the prairie. The room was clean, cleaner than the rest of the house anyway, and there was a quilt on the bed that had been carefully made, the corners tucked in with precision. Someone had cared about this room once. Someone had prepared it for visitors who never came. It's perfect, Maribel said, meaning it. After 3 years sharing cramped quarters with other women, after nights sleeping on trains, after the constant fear of having nowhere to sleep at all, this small room felt like a luxury. Really? Eli's face lit up. You really like it? I really do. Thank you for sharing your home with me, Eli. The boy ducked his head, suddenly shy. Papa says we're supposed to help people when they need it. That's what Mama would have wanted. Before Maribel could respond, she heard Caleb's boots on the stairs. He appeared in the doorway with her suitcase, his large frame nearly filling the opening. For a moment, they just looked at each other, 2 strangers thrown together by circumstance, both uncertain what came next. I'll let you get settled, Caleb said, setting the suitcase down carefully. There's a basin and pitcher on the dresser if you want to wash up. Supper will be in about an hour. Nothing fancy, just beans and cornbread. It's about all Eli and I can manage these days. That sounds wonderful, Maribel said. But if you don't mind, I'd like to help with the cooking. I'm not much good at sitting idle. Caleb's eyebrows rose. You've been traveling for 3 days and had your whole world turned upside down. You should rest. I've been sitting on a train for 3 days, Maribel corrected. What I need is to do something useful. Besides, if I'm staying here, I should earn my keep. She saw him measuring her words, trying to determine if she meant them or if she was just being polite. Finally, he nodded. All right, kitchen's downstairs, back of the house. I need to check on the horses and make sure the barn's secure for the night. When I come back in, we can figure out supper together. After he left, Maribel stood alone in the small bedroom, listening to the house settle around her. Through the window, she could see Caleb walking toward the barn, his gait easy and confident, a man comfortable in his element. Eli had followed him, trotting to keep up with his father's longer stride. She watched them disappear into the barn, then turned to survey her temporary home. The room was sparse, but not cold. Someone had hung simple curtains. The same lavender scent she'd noticed downstairs clung faintly to the fabric. Sarah's work, most likely. A woman making her house into a home, creating beauty in this harsh landscape. Maribel opened her suitcase and carefully removed her belongings. The 2 spare dresses, the nightgown, the undergarments she'd washed and mended so many times the fabric was nearly transparent in places. Her mother's Bible, leather-worn and spine-cracked from years of reading. The silver hairbrush, tarnished now but still solid, still beautiful in its way. And at the bottom, wrapped in a scrap of cloth, the letters from Miles Dandridge. She stood holding those letters for a long moment, feeling the weight of broken promises in her hands. Then, with deliberate care, she walked to the window, opened it, and let the Wyoming wind take them. The pages scattered across the prairie grass, tumbling end over end, and she watched them go without regret. Whatever Miles Dandridge had promised, whatever lies he'd told, they didn't matter now. She was done with false hopes and empty words. From here on, she would deal only in what was real and solid and true. After washing her face and hands in the basin, the water was lukewarm but clean. Maribel changed into her other dress. a simple blue cotton that was slightly less travel-worn than the gray. She unpinned her hair, brushed out the tangles and trained soot, then repinned it into a more respectable bun. Looking at herself in the small mirror above the dresser, she barely recognized the woman staring back. Her face was thinner than it had been a year ago, her eyes shadowed with exhaustion and disappointment. But there was something else there too, a stubborn set to her jaw that said she wasn't finished fighting yet. Downstairs, she found the kitchen easily enough. It was a good-sized room with a cast-iron stove, a large table that could seat 6, open shelves lined with dishes and supplies, and windows that would catch the morning sun. Like the rest of the house, it was functional but neglected, with dishes piled in a tin sink and flour dusted across the counter from what looked like a failed bread-making attempt. Maribel rolled up her sleeves and got to work. First, she pumped water and heated it on the stove, then tackled the dishes with fierce determination. The physical labor felt good after days of forced stillness on the train. Her hands knew what to do: wash, rinse, dry, stack. It was mindless and soothing, and it kept her from thinking too hard about the precariousness of her situation. She was elbow-deep in soapy water when she heard the back door open. Caleb and Eli came in, bringing the smell of animals and hay with them. Caleb stopped short when he saw her at the sink, surrounded by clean dishes. "You didn't have to do that," he said, but she heard approval beneath the protest. "I told you, I'm not good at sitting idle." Maribel rinsed the last plate and set it in the drying rack. "Now, what about this supper? Where do you keep your beans?" For the next hour, the kitchen became a space of quiet cooperation. Caleb showed her where things were stored: the beans in a jar on the shelf, the cornmeal in a tin, the salt pork wrapped in cloth in the cold cellar. Maribel set about making supper while Caleb built up the fire in the stove, and Eli set the table, his small hands carefully arranging the plates and forks with endearing precision. "Mama always said the table should be pretty," Eli explained, adjusting a fork that was slightly crooked. "Even if the food's simple, the table should be pretty." "Your mama was right," Maribel agreed. "Presentation matters. It shows respect for the food and the people eating it." She could feel Caleb watching her as she worked, but his gaze wasn't intrusive or uncomfortable. He seemed genuinely curious, as if trying to figure out who this woman was who'd appeared on the train platform and disrupted his carefully controlled grief. "You know your way around a kitchen," he observed, leaning against the counter with his arms crossed. "I should. I've been cooking since I was 8 years old. My mother worked as a seamstress, long hours for little pay. Someone had to make sure we ate." "No father?" "He died when I was 3. Accident at the docks. I don't remember it." She stirred the beans, adding a bit of salt pork for flavor. "It was just me and my mother for 14 years. Then just me. No other family? None that wanted anything to do with them. My mother's people disowned her when she married my father. He was Irish immigrant. She was from an old Boston family. They considered it a scandal." Maribel smiled without humor. "Amazing how quickly family can decide you don't exist when you embarrass them." "I know something about that," Caleb said quietly. "My family didn't approve of Sarah. Said she was too educated for a rancher's wife, that she'd never be happy out here. They were wrong about the happiness part, but they cut us off all the same. Didn't even come to the funeral." The beans were simmering nicely now, and Maribel turned her attention to the cornbread, mixing meal and water and a bit of precious sugar into a thick batter. "Seems like there's a lot of that going around. Families who love you conditionally, who decide you're only worth knowing if you do what they want. Is that why you answered Dandridge's advertisement?" Caleb asked. "No family to help you?" Maribel poured the batter into a greased pan before answering. "I answered because I was tired of being afraid. Tired of wondering if Mrs. Pemberton would raise the rent again, or if one of the male tenants would finally work up the courage to try my door handle at night. Tired of having no control over my own life." She slid the pan into the oven and closed the door with more force than necessary. "I thought marrying a stranger in Wyoming couldn't be worse than what I was already living. Turns out I was wrong about the stranger part, but right about leaving Philadelphia. Even now? Even stranded in a place you don't know with no prospects?" She turned to face him fully, meeting his dark eyes with her own. "Even now. At least here, I get to choose what happens next. Even if all my choices are bad ones, they're mine." Something shifted in Caleb's expression. Understanding, maybe, or respect. That's a hard way to live. It's the only way I know. Eli, who'd been listening to this exchange with wide eyes, suddenly spoke up. You could stay here forever. Then you wouldn't have to choose bad things. You could choose us. The simple statement hung in the air like a prayer. Maribel's throat tightened and she saw Caleb stiffen, clearly uncomfortable with his son's attachment to a woman who'd be leaving in a matter of days. Eli, Caleb started, his voice gentle but firm. Maribel has her own life to figure out. We can't... I know, Eli interrupted, and his voice was suddenly much older than his years. I know she has to go. Everyone goes eventually. He looked at Maribel with those storm gray eyes. But it would be nice if just once, someone stayed. The words pierced Maribel's heart like a blade. She knelt down in front of the boy, heedless of her dress on the dusty floor. Eli, listen to me. I don't know what's going to happen tomorrow or next week or next month, but I promise you this. While I'm here, I'm really here. I won't pretend to be someone I'm not, and I won't make promises I can't keep. Can that be enough? Eli studied her face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Okay. Okay, she echoed, and rose to her feet, her knees protesting slightly. They ate supper at the big kitchen table as the last light faded from the windows. The beans were simple but filling, the cornbread golden and surprisingly good considering the ancient oven she'd worked with. Eli ate with the single-minded focus of a growing boy, but Maribel noticed he kept glancing at her, as if reassuring himself she was still there. Caleb ate more slowly, and she caught him watching her several times with an expression she couldn't quite read. Not attraction, it was too soon for that, too raw, but something else. Curiosity, maybe, or the cautious assessment of a man who'd been burned before and was determined not to make the same mistake twice. This is good, he said finally, gesturing to his plate. Better than anything Eli and I have managed in months. It's just beans and cornbread. It's a hot meal at a clean table. That's more than we've had in a while. He paused, then added quietly, Thank you. After supper, Maribel insisted on cleaning up despite Caleb's protests. Eli helped her, carefully carrying dishes to the sink and drying them with a towel that was too big for him. As they worked, the boy chattered about the ranch, about his favorite horse, a mare named Daisy, about the calf that had been born last spring, about the swimming hole down by the creek where his mother used to take him on hot days. Maybe you could come swimming with me, Eli suggested hopefully, if you're still here when it gets hot again. Maybe, Maribel said, not wanting to encourage false hope, but unable to crush the tentative joy in his voice. When the dishes were done and the kitchen restored to order, Caleb sent Eli upstairs to get ready for bed. The boy went reluctantly, dragging his feet, clearly afraid that if he left Maribel alone, she might disappear like his mother had. I'll still be here in the morning, she assured him. I promise. You won't leave in the night? No, sweetheart. I won't leave in the night. After Eli trudged upstairs, Maribel and Caleb stood in the kitchen, the silence between them suddenly awkward. The intimacy of the shared meal, the easy cooperation in the kitchen, had created a false sense of familiarity that now felt uncomfortable in the wake of Eli's absence. I should check on the stock one more time, Caleb said, reaching for his hat. Make sure everything's secured for the night. Of course. He started toward the door, then stopped. Maribel? About what Eli said earlier, about wanting you to stay. I hope you don't think I put him up to that. He's struggling. He latched onto you because you look like Sarah, but also because you're the first person who's treated him like he matters in months. You treat him like he matters. I try, but I'm drowning too, and I think he knows it. I think he can feel how much I'm failing him every day. Caleb's voice was rough with self-recrimination. I loved Sarah more than I knew how to say. When she died, it was like someone carved out my insides and left me walking around as an empty shell. And the worst part is, Eli needs me to be whole, needs me to be strong, and I can't figure out how to give him that when I'm barely holding myself together. The raw honesty stole Maribel's breath. She'd expected polite distance, the kind of careful boundaries people usually maintained with strangers. Instead, Caleb was laying himself bare, showing her his failures and his fears without shame. Grief doesn't work on a schedule, she said softly. You don't just wake up one day and decide to be done with it. It's there every morning when you open your eyes, and it's there every night when you try to sleep. The best you can do is learn to carry it without letting it crush you. And how do you do that? Caleb asked, his dark eyes searching her face. How do you carry it without being crushed? I don't know. I'm still figuring that out myself. They stood looking at each other in the lamplight, two broken people recognizing their own damage in someone else's face. Then Caleb settled his hat on his head and walked out into the darkness, leaving Maribel alone with the ghosts in the house. She spent the next hour tidying the front room, unable to simply sit and rest. She folded the newspapers, organized the ranch accounts into neat stacks, swept the floor, and beat the dust from the sofa cushions. Physical labor kept her mind quiet, kept the panic at bay, kept her from thinking too hard about what she would do when these few days of borrowed time ran out. When she finally climbed the stairs to her small borrowed bedroom, exhaustion hit her like a physical force. She changed into her nightgown, unpinned her hair, and slipped between sheets that smelled faintly of cedar and lavender. Through the thin walls, she could hear Caleb moving around in what must be his room, the creak of floorboards, the sound of boots being dropped. She closed her eyes and tried to sleep, but her mind kept circling back to the same impossible questions. What would she do? Where would she go? How would she survive? The answers wouldn't come, and eventually she gave up trying to find them. Instead, she lay in the darkness and listened to the unfamiliar sounds of the ranch, the wind moving through the grass, the distant call of a night bird, the soft stirring of horses in a barn. It was so different from Philadelphia, from the constant noise of the city, from the shouting and laughter and crying that filtered through Mrs. Pemberton's thin walls. Here, the silence was almost alive, pressing against the windows, seeping through the crack. It should have been frightening, but instead, Maribel found it oddly comforting, as if the emptiness outside matched the emptiness inside her. And for once, she wasn't pretending to be something she wasn't. She must have finally slept, because she woke to sunlight streaming through the window and the smell of coffee drifting up from downstairs. For a moment, she was disoriented, unable to place where she was or how she'd gotten there. Then memory returned. The train platform, the missing groom, the boy who'd called her mama, the cowboy who'd offered her shelter. Maribel dressed quickly in her blue cotton dress, pinned her hair into a neat bun, and descended the stairs. In the kitchen, she found Caleb already up and moving, pouring coffee into a battered tin cup. He looked like he hadn't slept much. There were dark circles under his eyes, and his hair was disheveled. But he offered her a tentative smile. "Morning. Hope the roosters didn't wake you. They start making a racket about dawn." "I didn't hear them." Maribel accepted the cup of coffee he poured, wrapping her hands around it for warmth. The morning was cool, despite the promise of heat later. "Where's Eli?" "Still sleeping. Boy could sleep through a stampede when he's really out." Caleb leaned against the counter, studying her over the rim of his cup. "How'd you sleep?" "Better than I expected, considering." She took a sip of the coffee. It was strong and bitter, but good. Better than I have in months, actually. Quiet helps. City noise gets in your bones after a while. They stood in companionable silence for a moment, drinking their coffee, watching the sunlight paint golden squares across the kitchen floor. Then Caleb set down his cup and cleared his throat. "I've been thinking," he said, "about your situation, about what you're going to do next." Maribel's stomach clenched. Here it came, the gentle but firm suggestion that she move on, find other accommodations, stop imposing on his grief and his household. "I know I can't stay here indefinitely," she said quickly, trying to maintain her dignity. "I just need a few days to—" "That's not what I meant," Caleb interrupted. "Actually, I have a proposal, a business arrangement, if you will." She looked at him warily. "What kind of arrangement?" "You need work. I need help. The ranch is falling apart because I can't keep up with everything. The stock, the repairs, the household, taking care of Eli. I need someone who can manage the house, cook proper meals, maybe help with some of the lighter chores. You want to hire me as a housekeeper? I want to hire you as help. Call it what you want. Housekeeper, hired hand, whatever makes you comfortable. Room and board, plus $20 a month. It's not much, but it's fair wages for the work." $20 a month. Maribel's mind raced, calculating. In a few months, she could save enough to move on, to try again somewhere else. Or maybe even stay longer, build something resembling stability. Why? She asked bluntly. You don't know me. I could be a terrible cook, I could be lazy or dishonest or any number of things. Why would you offer this to a complete stranger? Caleb met her eyes steadily. Because yesterday, my son smiled for the first time in 6 months. Because you cleaned my kitchen without being asked and cooked a meal that actually tasted like someone gave a damn about it. Because you knelt down in the dust and promised a grieving boy you wouldn't lie to him. He paused. And because I saw how you looked at that train station when you realized your groom wasn't coming. I saw someone who'd been disappointed so many times they'd stopped expecting anything better. I know what that looks like because I see it in my mirror every morning. The words hit Maribel like a fist to the chest. She wanted to be suspicious, wanted to look for the trap, the hidden cost, the inevitable betrayal. But all she saw in Caleb Turner's face was exhaustion and honesty and a desperate hope that maybe, just maybe, this could work out for both of them. I'll need to set some ground rules, she said carefully. Such as, this is a business arrangement. You're my employer, not my... She struggled for the right word. Not anything else. I keep my own room, I make my own choices, and if at any point this stops working for either of us, we can end it with no hard feelings. Agreed. And Eli. I won't encourage him to think of me as a replacement for his mother. I'll be kind to him. I'll take care of him, but I won't pretend to be something I'm not. That's fair. That's more than fair. Caleb extended his hand. So, do we have a deal? Maribel looked at his outstretched hand, calloused, scarred, honest, and thought about all the hands that had reached for her over the years. Hands that took without asking. Hands that made promises they never intended to keep. Hands that pushed her away when she was no longer useful. This hand was different. She didn't know how she knew, but she did. She reached out and shook it firmly. We have a deal. The relief that washed over Caleb's face was almost painful to witness. Thank you. You don't know what this means. I think I do, Maribel said quietly. I think we're both getting a second chance we didn't expect. A thump from upstairs announced Eli's awakening, followed by the sound of small feet hitting the floor. Moments later, the boy appeared in the kitchen doorway, his hair sticking up in all directions, his face still creased from the pillow. You're still here, he breathed, and the relief in his voice was heartbreaking. I told you I would be, Maribel reminded him gently. And I'm going to be here for a while longer. Your father has hired me to help around the ranch. Eli's eyes went wide. You're staying, really staying. For now, yes. The boy launched himself across the kitchen and wrapped his arms around her waist, holding on tight. Over his head, Maribel met Caleb's eyes, and in that moment, she understood that they'd all just stepped off a cliff together. Whether they'd fall or fly remained to be seen. But for the first time in longer than she could remember, Maribel felt something that might have been hope stirring in her chest. It was fragile and frightening, barely more than a whisper, but it was there. And maybe, just maybe, that would be enough. The days that followed fell into a rhythm that surprised Maribel with its ease. She rose with the sun, dressed quickly in the cool morning air, and descended to the kitchen before Caleb and Eli stirred. There was something deeply satisfying about being the first one awake, about having those quiet moments to herself before the day's demands began. She'd make coffee, start breakfast, and watch the prairie come alive through the kitchen window as the sky shifted from gray to pink to gold. By the end of the first week, the house had transformed. Maribel scrubbed floors, washed curtains, beat rugs, and organized shelves with the fierce determination of someone who needed to prove her worth. She found Sarah's recipe book tucked in a drawer, pages stained and dog-eared, notes written in careful script, and taught herself to make the dishes Eli remembered his mother cooking. Pot roast with carrots, apple cobbler, biscuits that were almost as fluffy as the ones he described with reverent detail. Caleb worked from dawn until dusk, mending fences, tending cattle, breaking horses, doing all the 100 tasks that kept a ranch running. He'd come in for meals exhausted and dusty, his hands scraped raw, his shirt soaked with sweat. But Maribel noticed he started lingering at the table after supper, talking about the day's work, asking her opinion on small matters, teaching Eli his letters while she washed dishes. And Eli bloomed like a flower after rain. The hollow look began to fade from his eyes. He started sleeping through the night without nightmares. He laughed more, played more, brought Maribel wildflowers from the prairie and smooth stones from the creek. He followed her around the house like a shadow, chattering endlessly, and while she was careful not to let him call her mama, she couldn't help but respond to his desperate need for maternal attention. It was on the 10th day, as Maribel was hanging laundry in the yard, that she saw the rider approaching from the east. She shaded her eyes against the midday sun, watching the figure grow larger, and felt an inexplicable sense of unease settle over her. Something about the way the man sat his horse, too casual, too confident, like he owned everything he surveyed, set her teeth on edge. Caleb emerged from the barn, and she saw his posture stiffen when he spotted the rider. His hand moved unconsciously to his hip, as if checking for a gun that wasn't there. "Go inside," he called to Maribel, his voice hard. "Who is it?" "Just go inside. Take Eli with you." But it was too late. The rider had already covered the distance to the house, and now Maribel could see him clearly. He was perhaps 40, with slicked back dark hair and a mustache waxed to sharp points. He wore expensive clothes, a vest with silver buttons, polished boots, a hat that probably cost more than Maribel made in 3 months. Everything about him screamed money and self-importance. He pulled his horse to a stop and surveyed the ranch with an expression of amused disdain. His eyes passed over Caleb dismissively, then landed on Maribel and stayed there, traveling up and down her body with the kind of proprietorial assessment that made her skin crawl. "Well, well," the man said, his voice smooth as oil. "Looks like someone's been making improvements around here, Turner. Got yourself a new housekeeper?" "What do you want, Dandridge?" Caleb's voice was cold enough to freeze water. Maribel's blood turned to ice. Dandridge, Miles Dandridge. The man she was supposed to marry. The man who'd abandoned her at the train station. She stood frozen, a wet sheet in her hands, as Miles Dandridge dismounted with elaborate care and approached her with a smile that didn't reach his eye. "My dear Miss Hayes," he said, sweeping off his hat in a mockery of gentlemanly behavior, "I cannot apologize enough for the unfortunate misunderstanding at the station. I was detained by urgent business in Denver and only just returned to find your telegram waiting. Naturally, I rode here immediately to collect you and make amends for your tardiness." Every word was a lie. Maribel could see it in the way his eyes shifted, in the practiced smoothness of his delivery, and the complete absence of genuine remorse. This was a man who lied as easily as breathing. "Collect me?" she repeated, finding her voice. "Like a piece of luggage you left at the station?" Miles's smile tightened. "I understand you're upset, my dear. Any woman would be after such an ordeal. But now that I'm here, we can proceed with the wedding arrangements and—" "She's not going anywhere with you," Caleb interrupted, moving to stand between Maribel and Miles. "She's got employment here, room, board, and fair wages. She doesn't need your charity or your lies." Miles's expression hardened, the false congeniality dropping away like a discarded mask. "Employment? Is that what we're calling it?" He looked past Caleb to Maribel, his eyes calculating. "How convenient for you, Turner. Your wife barely cold in the ground, and already you've got a replacement warming your bed." "You son of a—" Caleb lunged forward, but Maribel grabbed his arm, stopping him. "Don't," she said quietly. "He's not worth it." Miles laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Oh, she's got you well trained already. Tell me, Miss Hayes, how long did it take you to work your way into his house? Did you plan this from the beginning, or was seducing a grieving widower just a happy accident?" The accusation struck like physical blows, but Maribel forced herself to stand tall, to meet Miles's contemptuous gaze without flinching. She'd been called worse things by better people. "Mr. Dandridge," she said, her voice steady despite the rage burning in her chest, "I don't know what kind of women you usually associate with, but I'm not property to be collected when convenient. You made me an offer, you failed to honor it, and I've made other arrangements. Consider our agreement null and void." "That's not how this works," Miles said, his voice dropping to something dangerous. "You came here to marry me. You accepted my proposal. That makes you mine, whether you like it or not." "Yours?" Maribel repeated incredulously. "I'm not a horse or a piece of land. I'm a human being, and I can change my mind. Not when there's a contract involved." Miles reached into his vest and pulled out a folded paper, waving it like a weapon. You signed this, agreeing to marry me in exchange for passage to Wyoming and a home. I paid for your train ticket, which makes you legally obligated to fulfill the terms of our agreement." Maribel's stomach dropped. She had signed something, a brief letter of agreement, nothing elaborate, just a simple acknowledgement that she accepted his proposal and would travel to Wyoming to become his wife. At the time, it had seemed like a formality. Now she realized it might be a trap. "You paid for her ticket?" Caleb's voice was sharp. Funny, because Maribel told me she borrowed money to pay for it herself. Miles's expression flickered, just for a moment, but it was enough. Maribel saw the truth written there plainly. He'd lied about paying for her passage, probably to make his claim of ownership more legitimate. "I reimbursed her," Miles said quickly. "Sent the money ahead as any gentleman would." "Show me the receipt," Maribel demanded. "If you sent money, you'll have a receipt from the bank or the telegraph office." Miles's jaw tightened. "I don't need to prove anything to you. The contract is clear. You agreed to marry me, and I'm here to hold you to that agreement. Now, get your things. We're leaving." "No," Maribel said simply. "No?" Miles took a step closer, and there was real menace in his voice now. "You seem to be confused about your position here, Miss Hayes. You're an unmarried woman alone in a territory you don't know, with no family, no resources, and no legal standing. I, on the other hand, am a respected landowner with connections throughout the territory. If I say you're my intended bride, who's going to contradict me? Who's going to take your word over mine?" "I will," Caleb said, his voice like steel. "And so will every decent person in Red Butte who knows what kind of man you really are." Miles turned on him with a snarl. "Decent people? You mean the same people who whisper about how quickly you've taken up with another woman after your wife died? The same people who wonder if maybe Sarah's death wasn't quite as natural as you claimed?" Caleb went white, and Maribel saw his hands clench into fists. "You're a lying piece of... Am I lying? Or am I just saying what everyone's thinking?" Miles's smile was cruel now, enjoying the pain he was inflicting. Poor Sarah, married to a man who couldn't provide properly, working herself to death trying to make that pathetic excuse for a ranch succeed. Is it any wonder she got sick? Is it any wonder she didn't have the strength to fight off a simple fever? "Get off my land," Caleb said, his voice shaking with barely controlled rage. "Get off my land before I do something we'll both regret. I'll leave when I get what I came for." Miles turned back to Maribel. "Last chance, Miss Hayes. Come with me now, and we'll say no more about this unfortunate incident. Refuse, and I'll make sure everyone from here to Cheyenne knows you're a woman of questionable morals who broke a legal contract to take up with a grieving widower. You'll never find respectable work anywhere in this territory." The threat hung in the air like poison. Maribel felt the weight of it, understood the power Miles held over her reputation, her future, her very survival in this place. One word from him could destroy the fragile stability she'd built over the past 10 days. But as she stood there, feeling the sun on her face and the wind in her hair, she realized something important. She'd spent 3 years in Philadelphia being afraid of losing her room, afraid of the men in the hallways, afraid of starving, afraid of ending up on the streets. Fear had governed every choice, every decision, every moment of her life. She was done being afraid. "Then I guess you'll have plenty to talk about," she said clearly, "because I'm not going anywhere." Miles's face darkened with fury. "You stupid, ungrateful... That's enough," Caleb interrupted, moving to stand shoulder to shoulder with Maribel. "She said no. That's the end of it." "This isn't over," Miles hissed. "That contract is legally binding, and I will enforce it. I'll take this to the territorial court if I have to. I'll... Papa! Papa!" They all turned to see Eli running from the house, his face streaked with tears. He'd obviously been watching from the window, and the raised voices had frightened him. He ran straight to Maribel, wrapping his arms around her waist and pressing his face against her dress. "Don't let him take her, Papa," the boy sobbed. "Please don't let him take her away." Miles looked at the crying child with undisguised disgust. How touching. The replacement mother and the pathetic orphan. You're all perfect for each other, broken, desperate, clinging to whatever scraps you can find. Something in Maribel snapped. She'd endured his insults, his threats, his attempts to intimidate her. but watching him look at a grieving 8-year-old with contempt was too much. She stepped forward, putting herself between Miles and Eli, and when she spoke, her voice was cold as winter wind. You're absolutely right about one thing, Mr. Dandridge. We are broken. Life has beaten us down and taken away the people we loved and left us struggling to survive. But that doesn't make us weak. That doesn't make us pathetic. It makes us survivors. And I'd rather be broken and honest than whole and rotten like you. For a moment, Miles just stared at her, shock written plainly on his face. Then his expression twisted into something ugly. You'll regret this, he said softly. Both of you. I'll make sure of it. He turned and strode to his horse, mounting in one fluid motion. Before riding away, he looked back at them, his eyes promising retribution. This isn't over, he repeated. Not by a long shot. They watched him ride away, his horse kicking up dust that hung in the air like a bad omen. Maribel felt Eli trembling against her, and she placed a protective hand on his head, stroking his hair gently. Is he going to take you away? Eli whispered. No, sweetheart, he's not going to take me anywhere. But he said a lot of things, most of them lies. Maribel looked at Caleb, whose face was still pale with anger. Right? Caleb seemed to shake himself out of a dark reverie. Right. He can't force you to marry him, no matter what he claims about contracts. This is America, not medieval Europe. People don't own other people. But he could make trouble for us, Maribel said quietly. He could spread rumors, like he threatened. He could... Let him try, Caleb said fiercely. Let him go to every gossip in the territory. Anyone who knows me knows what kind of man I am. And anyone who meets you will know you're not the kind of woman who tried to make you out to be. Maribel wanted to believe him, but she'd learned long ago that reputation meant everything, and truth meant nothing when people wanted to think badly of you. Still, what choice did she have? Running away would only prove Miles's accusations, would mark her as exactly the kind of woman he claimed she was. We should go into town, Caleb said decisively. Talk to the sheriff. Get this documented properly. If Dandridge is threatening legal action, we need to get ahead of it. Will the sheriff listen to us? Tom Bradshaw is a fair man. He'll listen. And he knows Miles's reputation. This isn't the first time Dandridge has pulled something like this. They went inside, and while Caleb changed into cleaner clothes, Maribel helped Eli wash his face and calm down. The boy clung to her, still frightened by the confrontation he'd witnessed.
That man was mean, Eli said. He said mean things about you and Papa. Yes, he did. Some people are mean because they're angry at the world, and they want everyone else to hurt too. Mama used to say hurt people hurt people. Maribel smiled despite the tension knotting her stomach. Your mama was a wise woman. 20 minutes later, they were all in the wagon, heading toward Red Butte. The ride was tense, with Caleb's jaw clenched and his eyes constantly scanning the horizon, as if expecting Miles to return with reinforcements. Eli sat pressed against Maribel's side, quieter than usual, his earlier exuberance dampened by fear. The town looked the same as it had 10 days ago, dusty, small, clinging to existence in the vast prairie. But now Maribel saw it differently. This was where she'd have to fight for her right to stay, where her reputation would be made or destroyed based on who believed Miles's lies and who was willing to see the truth.
The sheriff's office was a small building near the center of town, with bars on the windows and a hitching post out front. Caleb helped Maribel down from the wagon, and they went inside together, Eli staying close on her other side. Sheriff Tom Bradshaw was a man in his 50s, with iron gray hair and a weathered face that spoke of decades spent outdoors. He looked up from paperwork as they entered, and his expression shifted from mild curiosity to concern when he saw Caleb's face. Caleb, he said, rising from his desk. What's wrong? Miles Dandridge, Caleb said flatly. He showed up at my ranch today making threats. The sheriff's eyes narrowed. What kind of threats? The kind involving Miss Hayes here. Caleb gestured to Maribel. She was supposed to be Dandridge's mail-order bride, but he never showed up at the station when she arrived. I gave her employment at my ranch. Now he's claiming she's legally obligated to marry him and threatening to take her by force if necessary. Sheriff Bradshaw turned his attention to Maribel, studying her with eyes that missed nothing. Is this true, ma'am? Yes, sir, Maribel said, keeping her voice steady. I responded to Mr. Dandridge's advertisement and agreed to travel to Wyoming to marry him. But when I arrived, he wasn't there. Mr. Turner offered me work as his housekeeper, which I accepted. Mr. Dandridge showed up today claiming I'm his property and threatening legal action if I don't agree to marry him. Property, the sheriff repeated, his mouth tightening. Those were his words? His exact words were, "That makes you mine, whether you like it or not." The sheriff muttered something under his breath that might have been a curse. Did he threaten violence? Not directly, Caleb interjected, but he was intimidating, aggressive. He made implications about Maribel's character in mind, and he threatened to spread rumors designed to destroy both our reputations. Did he produce any documentation? Any contract? He waved around a letter, Maribel said. Something I signed agreeing to the marriage arrangement. But Sheriff, I never received any money from him, and he abandoned me at the station. Doesn't that void any agreement we might have had? Sheriff Bradshaw leaned back against his desk, his expression thoughtful. I'm not a lawyer, ma'am, but I can tell you this much. We don't enforce slavery contracts in this territory. If you don't want to marry Miles Dandridge, no piece of paper can force you to. Now, he could potentially sue you for breach of contract, try to recover any money he claims to have spent on your behalf. But that's a civil matter for the courts. He also lied, Caleb added. He claimed he paid for Maribel's train fare, but she told me she borrowed the money herself. That's fraud. Can you prove it? The sheriff asked Maribel. I can show you my ledger from Philadelphia. I documented the loan from Mrs. Pemberton and how I plan to pay it back, but I don't have the physical proof with me. Could you get it? I suppose I could write to Mrs. Pemberton and ask her to send documentation, but that would take weeks. The sheriff nodded slowly. Here's what I can do. I can document your complaint officially, put it on record that you've terminated any agreement with Dandridge, and that he's been making threats. If he tries anything else, shows up at the Turner Ranch again, attempts to coerce you, spreads provably false rumors, you come straight back here and we'll deal with it. I can't arrest him for being an unpleasant human being, but I can make sure he knows he's being watched. It wasn't much, but it was something. Maribel felt a small measure of relief ease the tightness in her chest. There's something else you should know, the sheriff continued, his voice grim. Miles Dandridge isn't the upstanding citizen he pretends to be. He's done this before, advertising for brides, taking their money, then disappearing or making their lives hell when they arrive. We've had 3 complaints in the last 2 years, but the women were too frightened or too ashamed to press charges. If you're willing to stand up to him, officially, it might give the others courage to come forward too. 3 other women. 3 other lives disrupted or destroyed by Miles Dandridge's schemes. The knowledge made Maribel's blood boil. I'll do whatever it takes, she said firmly. You shouldn't be allowed to keep doing this to people. Good. Sheriff Bradshaw pulled out a ledger and dipped his pen in ink. Let's get your statement recorded. Tell me everything, from the beginning. For the next hour, Maribel recounted the entire story. The advertisement, the letters, her journey from Philadelphia, the abandoned meeting at the station, Miles's appearance at the ranch, and his threats. Caleb corroborated everything, adding his own observations about Miles's character and past behavior. Eli sat quietly in the corner, drawing pictures in the dust on the floor with his finger. When it was finished, Sheriff Bradshaw blew on the ink to dry it, then closed the ledger with a decisive thump. All right, he said. This is officially documented. If Dandridge makes any more threats, you let me know immediately. In the meantime, I'll have a word with him myself. Make sure he understands that harassing you will have consequences. Thank you, Sheriff, Maribel said sincerely. Don't thank me yet. Miles Dandridge is a snake, and snakes don't give up easy. He's got money and connections, and he knows how to use both to get what he wants. This fight isn't over. I know, Maribel said, but at least now it's an honest fight. That's more than I usually get. They left the sheriff's office and stepped back into the bright afternoon sunlight. The street was busy with the usual traffic. Wagons, horses, people going about their business. Maribel wondered how many of them would hear Miles's version of events, how many would believe his lie, how many would look at her with suspicion or contempt. We should stop at the Mercantile while we're here, Caleb said, breaking into her dark thoughts.
Stock up on supplies." They walked down the main street together, and Maribel was acutely aware of the stairs following them. News traveled fast in small towns, and Miles had probably already started spreading his poison. She could see it in the way people looked at her, curious, judgmental, already making up their minds about who she was and what she'd done. At Jameson's Mercantile, a woman with gray hair and sharp eyes stood behind the counter.
She looked up as they entered, and her gaze went immediately to Maribel, traveling up and down with open assessment. "Mrs. Jameson," Caleb said politely, "I need to order some supplies." "I heard you had a new housekeeper," Mrs. Jameson said, ignoring his request. Her voice was neutral, but her eyes were calculating. "The mail-order bride who was supposed to marry Miles Dandridge." "Miss Hayes works for me," Caleb confirmed, his voice carefully controlled. "She's doing an excellent job managing the household." "I'm sure she is." Mrs. Jameson's tone suggested she thought Maribel was managing more than just the household. "It's just surprising, that's all. Your wife barely coaled in the ground, and already you've got another woman in her place." Maribel felt Caleb tense beside her, saw his jaw clench with anger. Before he could respond and make things worse, she stepped forward. "Mrs. Jameson," she said calmly, "I understand this looks unconventional, but Mr. Turner offered me honest employment when I had nowhere else to go, and I accepted it. That's all there is to it. If you have concerns about my character, I'd be happy to address them directly rather than have them whispered behind my back." Mrs. Jameson blinked, clearly not expecting such a direct response. "I wasn't implying—" "Yes, you were," Maribel interrupted gently. "And I don't blame you. I'm a stranger, and strangers should be viewed with caution. But I'm also a woman trying to survive in difficult circumstances, and I'd appreciate being judged on my actions rather than on gossip and assumptions." For a long moment, the older woman just stared at her. Then, surprisingly, her expression softened slightly. "Fair enough," she said. "What supplies do you need?" The tension in the room eased fractionally. They gave their order: flour, sugar, coffee, various staples, and while Mrs. Jameson assembled it, Eli wandered over to look at the candy jars on the counter. "Can I have a peppermint stick?" he asked hopefully. "May I?" Maribel corrected automatically. "And yes, if your father says it's all right." Caleb nodded, and Mrs. Jameson added a peppermint stick to their order. As she wrapped it in paper and handed it to Eli, she looked at Maribel again. "You handled Sarah's boy with natural ease," she observed. "Almost like you've done it before." "I haven't," Maribel admitted. "But I remember what it was like to be a child who needed gentleness. I try to give him what I wished I'd had." Something shifted in Mrs. Jameson's expression. Respect, maybe, or a grudging approval. "Sarah was a good woman. Eli deserves someone who would be good to him." "I agree," Maribel said simply. They loaded their supplies into the wagon and prepared to leave. As Caleb helped Maribel up onto the seat, she caught sight of a familiar figure across the street. Miles Dandridge, standing in front of the saloon, watching them with cold calculation written all over his face. Their eyes met, and Miles smiled. A slow, deliberate expression that promised nothing good. Then he tipped his hat in mocking salute and disappeared into the saloon. "He's planning something," Maribel said quietly. "I know," Caleb replied, his voice grim. "We'll deal with it when it comes." The ride back to the ranch was silent, each of them lost in their own thoughts. Eli sucked on his peppermint stick contentedly, but even his usual chatter was subdued. The confrontation with Miles had cast a shadow over all of them, a reminder that their fragile peace could be shattered at any moment. As they pulled into the ranch yard, the sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. It should have been beautiful, but all Maribel could think about was Miles Dandridge and his threats, and the battle she knew was coming. She'd made her choice. She'd stood up to him, refused his demands, aligned herself with Caleb Turner and his son. Now she would have to live with the consequences of that choice, whatever they might be. But as she climbed down from the wagon and felt Eli's small hand slip into hers, as she saw Caleb watching her with something like gratitude in his dark eyes, Maribel realized she didn't regret her decision. Not even a little. For the first time in her life, she'd chosen to fight instead of run. She'd chosen dignity over safety, honesty over convenience. She'd chosen to stand with people who needed her as much as she needed them. And if Miles Dandridge wanted a war, then by God, she'd give him one. The war came 3 days later, but not in the way Maribel expected. She was in the kitchen kneading bread dough when she heard the sound of multiple horses approaching. Through the window, she saw not just Miles Dandridge, but 5 other men riding with him. Rough-looking characters with guns on their hips and expressions that promised violence. Her heart seized in her chest. "Caleb!" she called out, her voice sharp with alarm. He appeared from the barn within seconds, saw the riders, and his face went hard as stone. "Get Eli and go upstairs. Lock yourself in my room, and don't come out no matter what you hear." "I'm not hiding while you..." "Maribel." He grabbed her shoulders, his dark eyes intense. "Please. If something happens to me, Eli needs your love. Go. Now." She wanted to argue, wanted to stand beside him, but the fear in his voice convinced her. She ran to find Eli, who was feeding the chickens behind the house, and pulled him inside. "What's wrong?" the boy asked, seeing her face. "Nothing, sweetheart. We're just going to play a game. We're going to go upstairs very quietly and stay in your papa's room until he comes together." Eli wasn't fooled. He was too smart for that, but he went with her without protest. Maribel locked them in Caleb's bedroom and positioned herself by the window where she could see the yard below. Eli pressed against her side, trembling. Miles and his men had dismounted now, spreading out in a loose semicircle around Caleb. Even from this distance, Maribel could see the calculation in their positioning. They were surrounding them, cutting off escape routes, making a show of force designed to intimidate. She couldn't hear what was being said, but she could see Miles talking, gesturing, his face animated with false righteousness. Caleb stood his ground, arms crossed, his posture defiant despite being outnumbered. One of Miles's men, a brutish-looking character with a scar across his cheek, kept his hand on his gun, ready to draw. "What are they doing?" Eli whispered. "Talking," Maribel said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Just talking." But it wasn't just talking. She could see the confrontation escalating, voices rising, Miles's face reddening with anger. Then one of the men stepped forward, pulling out a rolled paper, official-looking, with what appeared to be a seal or stamp. Her stomach dropped. Had Miles actually gone to a judge? Had he somehow obtained a legal order? Caleb took the paper, unrolled it, read it. Even from this distance, Maribel could see the shock and fury that washed over his features. He looked up at Miles and said something, sharp, angry words she couldn't make out. Miles just smiled and gestured to his men. 2 of them started walking toward the house. "No," Maribel breathed. "No, no, no." "What's happening?" Eli's voice was rising with panic. "It's going to be okay," she lied, her mind racing. She looked around the room desperately, searching for something she could use as a weapon. Caleb's rifle was mounted above the door, but she'd never fired a gun in her life. There was nothing else, just furniture and personal belongings. The front door crashed open downstairs. Heavy boots on the wooden floor, men's voices, harsh and invasive. "Miss Hayes," Miles's voice called up the stairs, saccharine sweet. "There's no need to make this difficult. I have a court order here requiring you to fulfill the terms of our contract. You can come down peacefully, or my associates can come up and fetch you. Your choice." Maribel's blood was ice in her veins. A court order. He'd actually done it. Had actually found some corrupt judge or clerk willing to issue a document forcing her to marry him. It didn't matter that such orders were supposed to be illegal. It didn't matter that this was supposed to be America where people couldn't be bought and sold. All that mattered was the paper in Miles's hand and the men with guns backing it up. "Don't go down there," Eli pleaded, clutching her dress. "Please don't leave us." Footsteps on the stairs now. They were coming. Maribel made a split-second decision. She couldn't fight them. She had no weapons, no training, and she wouldn't risk Eli getting hurt in any struggle. But she could document what was happening. She could make sure that if Miles took her by force, there would be witnesses, evidence, something to prove this was coercion and not consent. She grabbed the pencil and paper Caleb kept on his bedside table for ranch accounts and scribbled frantically. "Being taken against my will by Miles Dandridge and armed men. This is kidnapping, not consent. Maribel Hayes." She signed and dated it, then shoved it under the mattress where it might be found later. The door handle rattled. "Open up, Miss Hayes. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." "I'm coming," she called back, her voice surprisingly steady. She knelt in front of Eli, taking his face in her hands. "Listen to me, sweetheart. I have to go with them right now, but your papa and the sheriff are going to fix this. I'll be back. Do you hear me? I promise I'll be back. You promised you wouldn't leave, Eli sobbed. You promised. I'm not leaving. I'm being taken. That's different. And I swear to you, I will fight to come back to you and your papa. But right now I need to go with them so nobody gets hurt. Can you be brave for me? The door shuddered under a heavy blow. They were about to break it down. Maribel kissed Eli's forehead, then stood and unlocked the door. Two men stood there, both with hands on their guns. They looked her up and down with expressions that made her skin crawl. Smart choice, one of them said. Come on. She walked between them down the stairs, her head held high despite the terror coursing through her. In the front room, Miles waited with a smile of triumph on his face. He held out the paper for her to see. It did indeed appear to be some kind of court document, though Maribel suspected it was either forged or obtained through bribery. You see, Miles said pleasantly, everything legal and proper. The judge agreed that you signed a binding contract and must fulfill its terms. We're to be married this afternoon by Reverend Matthews, with these gentlemen serving as witnesses. This is kidnapping, Maribel said coldly. The sheriff has been informed and raised no objection. After all, I'm simply enforcing a legal contract, no crime in that. Miles extended his arm like a gentleman offering to escort a lady.
Shall we? Maribel ignored his arm and walked past him toward the door. Outside, Caleb was being restrained by two of Miles's men, one on each arm. His face was a mask of impotent rage, blood trickling from a cut above his eye where someone had struck him. I'll kill you for this, Dandridge, Caleb snarled. I swear to God. Threatening murder in front of witnesses, Miles interrupted cheerfully. Tisk, tisk. You're not helping your case, Turner. He turned to his men. Get her on a horse. We've wasted enough time here. One of the men grabbed Maribel's arm, fingers digging in hard enough to bruise, and started pulling her toward the horses. She stumbled, caught herself, and that's when she saw him. Eli, standing in the doorway of the house, his face streaked with tears, watching them take her away. Something broke inside Maribel then. Not her spirit, that remained intact, burning with righteous fury, but her willingness to go quietly. She'd spent her whole life being pushed around by circumstances and people with more power than her. She'd accepted it because she thought she had no choice, thought survival meant submission. But looking at that little boy's devastated face, she realized some things were worth fighting for, even when you knew you'd lose. No, she said, and ripped her arm from the man's grip. Miss Hayes, Miles started, his voice holding a warning. No, she repeated, louder this time. I won't go with you. I don't care what papers you forged or which corrupt official you've bribed. I am not your property. I am not a slave to be bought and sold, and I will not marry you. Miles's mask of civility finally cracked completely. His face contorted with rage, and he closed the distance between them in 3 quick strides. Before she could react, his hand cracked across her face, the blow snapping her head to the side and splitting her lip. You will do exactly what I tell you, he hissed. I've invested too much time and money in this to have some used-up Philadelphia whore ruin it now. Maribel tasted blood, felt it running down her chin, but she smiled anyway, a fierce, defiant expression that seemed to unsettle Miles more than any words could have. There it is, she said, the real Miles Danzig. Not the gentleman in the fancy clothes, but the monster underneath. Miles raised his hand to strike her again, but a voice cut through the tension like a gunshot. I wouldn't do that if I were you. Everyone turned. Sheriff Bradshaw sat on his horse at the edge of the property, and he wasn't alone. With him were 4 deputized men, all armed, all watching the scene with hard eyes. Behind them, Maribel could see Mrs. Jameson from the Mercantile in a wagon, along with several other townspeople. Witnesses. Real witnesses, not paid thugs. Relief crashed over Maribel so powerfully she almost collapsed. Miles's men immediately released Caleb and stepped back, their hands moving away from their guns. Miles himself went pale, his eyes darting between the sheriff and his escape routes. Sheriff, he said, recovering his composure with impressive speed. I'm glad you're here. As I explained earlier, I'm simply enforcing a legal contract that... Let me see that court order, Sheriff Bradshaw interrupted, dismounting and walking forward with his hand extended. Miles hesitated just a fraction too long before handing over the paper.
The sheriff read it carefully, his expression growing darker with each line. "This is a civil marriage contract enforcement order from Judge Hackett," he said slowly. "Problem is, Judge Hackett is currently in Denver on territorial business. Has been for the past 2 weeks. So unless he signed this document from 100 miles away, it's a forgery." The silence that followed was absolute.
Maribel watched the blood drain from Miles's face as he realized his scheme had just collapsed. "Furthermore," the sheriff continued, his voice hard as iron, "even if this were legitimate, you just struck an unarmed woman in front of multiple witnesses. That's assault, Dandridge. And holding someone against their will, regardless of what paper you're waving around, is kidnapping. She's a free citizen who has stated clearly and repeatedly that she doesn't want to marry you. That makes everything you've done here today criminal." Sheriff Bradshaw turned to his deputy. "Arrest him. Arrest all of them. We'll sort out charges back in town." What followed was chaos. Miles tried to run, but 2 deputies grabbed him before he'd taken 3 steps. His hired men scattered, but they were on foot. Their horses had been quietly collected by the other deputies, and they didn't get far. Within minutes, all 6 men were in handcuffs, Miles screaming about his rights and his connections and how the sheriff would regret this. Caleb, finally free, rushed to Maribel. His hands hovered over her face, taking in the split lip and the bruise already forming on her cheek. "Are you all right?" His voice was rough with emotion. "I'm fine," she said, though she was shaking now that the immediate danger had passed. "How did the sheriff know to come?" "Eli," Caleb said, and Maribel turned to see the boy running across the yard toward them. "When they took you downstairs, he climbed out the window, jumped onto the porch roof, and ran for help. He made it to the Johnson Ranch in record time, and they rode straight to town to get the sheriff." Maribel dropped to her knees as Eli reached her, catching him in her arms and holding him tight. "You brave, brilliant boy," she whispered into his hair. "You saved me." "I told you," Eli said, his voice muffled against her shoulder. "I told you nobody was going to take you away from us." Over Eli's head, Maribel met Caleb's eyes, and what she saw there made her breath catch. It wasn't just gratitude or relief. It was something deeper, more complex, a recognition of shared trauma, shared survival, shared determination to protect what they'd built together. "Miss Hayes?" Mrs. Jameson had climbed down from her wagon and was approaching with several other women from town. "We came as soon as we heard what Dandridge was attempting. Nobody in Red Butte holds with forcing women into marriage, no matter what papers might say." Maribel stood, still holding Eli's hand. "You came to help me?" "We came to help justice," Mrs. Jameson corrected. Her eyes were kind. "Miles Dandridge has been terrorizing women in this territory for too long. It's past time someone stood up to him, and past time the rest of us supported that someone instead of looking the other way." Sheriff Bradshaw finished securing his prisoners and walked over to their group. "Miss Hayes, I'll need a full statement from you when you're ready. Caleb too, and young Eli here." He looked at the boy with genuine respect. "That was quick thinking, son. You probably saved Miss Hayes' life today." "Is he going to jail?" Eli asked, pointing at Miles, who was being loaded into a wagon with his hands bound. "He's going to jail for a long time, if I have anything to say about it," the sheriff confirmed. "Assault, attempted kidnapping, forgery of legal documents, and I suspect once we dig deeper, we'll find evidence of fraud related to those other mail-order bride schemes. Miles Dandridge's days of hurting people are over." As if summoned by the mention of his name, Miles twisted in his captor's grip to look back at them. His face was twisted with hatred, all pretense of civility abandoned. "This isn't over," he shouted. "You hear me, Turner? I'll get out, and when I do, I'll take everything from you. Your ranch, your son, your whore housekeeper." One of the deputies slapped a hand over Miles's mouth, cutting off the rest of his vitriol. They shoved him into the wagon and secured the gate behind him. "Actually," Sheriff Bradshaw said quietly, "we found something interesting when we searched Dandridge's property earlier. Letters from at least 7 different women, all responding to his marriage advertisements, and receipts for money transfers, substantial amounts, that he claimed were for wedding preparations but were actually going into his personal accounts. We also found property deeds that don't belong to him. It appears Mr. Dandridge has been running a rather elaborate fraud operation for years." Maribel's head spun. 7 women. 7 other lives disrupted or destroyed by Miles's schemes.
Will they testify? If we can find them, yes. And with your willingness to press charges, we finally have a victim who's brave enough to stand up in court. The sheriff's expression was grim. This is going to be a long legal battle, Miss Hayes. Dandridge has money and connections, like I said. His lawyer will try every trick to get him off or reduce charges. Are you prepared for that? Maribel thought about running, about disappearing into another territory, another town, another identity where Miles Dandridge couldn't reach her. It would be easier, safer, simpler. Then she felt Eli's hand in hers, felt Caleb's presence solid and steady beside her, saw Mrs. Jameson and the other townswomen watching her with expressions of hope and determination. She thought about those 7 other women and all the future victims Miles would claim if someone didn't stop him. I'm prepared, she said clearly. I'll testify to everything. I'll stand up in court and tell the truth, no matter how long it takes. Sheriff Bradshaw smiled. A real smile, not the grim professional expression he'd worn before. Good. That's real good. Wyoming needs more women like you, Miss Hayes. The crowd began to disperse, the drama over, people heading back to their normal lives. The sheriff and his deputies prepared to transport the prisoners to town. Mrs. Jameson approached Maribel one more time before leaving. I misjudged you when you first arrived, the older woman said. I'm woman enough to admit when I'm wrong. You're not what I thought you were. What did you think I was? Desperate, opportunistic, someone looking to take advantage of a grieving widower. Mrs. Jameson paused. But I was wrong. You're just someone trying to survive with dignity, same as the rest of us. And you've got more courage than most. After she left, Maribel finally allowed herself to lean against Caleb, suddenly exhausted. He wrapped an arm around her shoulders, steadying her, and she felt Eli press against her other side. Let's get you inside, Caleb said gently. We need to tend to that lip and make sure you're really okay. They walked back to the house together, and Maribel was struck by how different it looked from when Miles's men had invaded it just an hour ago. It was still the same building, same porch, same weathered wood, but now it felt like a fortress that had withstood a siege, like home. Inside, Caleb sat her down at the kitchen table and brought water and clean cloth. He dabbed at her split lip with surprising gentleness for such rough hands, his face close to hers, his dark eyes full of concern. I should have protected you better, he said quietly. Should have seen this coming, should have been prepared. You were being held by armed men, Maribel interrupted. What exactly were you supposed to do? Something. Anything. I couldn't stand there watching him hurt you and not being able to stop it. But we did stop it. Together. With help from people we didn't even know. She winced as he touched a particularly tender spot. That's what matters. Eli had been sitting silently at the table, watching them, but now he spoke up. Are you really going to stay? Even after all that? Maribel looked at the boy's hopeful, frightened face, then at Caleb's careful expression, and realized they were both asking the same question in different ways. They were asking if she was going to run when things got hard, if she was going to abandon them the way Sarah had been forced to abandon them through death. I'm really going to stay, she said firmly. Miles Dandridge couldn't force me to leave. What makes you think anything else could? Relief washed over both their faces, father and son so similar in that moment, both of them wanting so desperately to believe but afraid to hope. But we need to talk, Maribel continued, looking at her. About the trial, about what's going to happen, about how this is going to look when people find out I'm testifying against a man I was supposed to marry. It's going to look like you're brave, Caleb said. It's going to look like you're doing the right thing. It's also going to look like I'm living with a man I'm not married to, like we're... She struggled for a delicate way to phrase it with Eli present. Like our arrangement is improper. Then we'll make it proper, Caleb said, and before Maribel could ask what he meant, he continued. I'll build you a separate cabin. Small place, just one room, but enough to give you independence. You can sleep there, have your own space. It'll show everyone this is purely a business arrangement. It was a generous offer, a way to protect her reputation and his own. But as Maribel looked around the kitchen, at the table where they shared meals, at the window where she'd stood watching the sunrise, at the doorway where Eli had run to her crying, she realized she didn't want a separate cabin. She didn't want independence and distance and carefully maintained boundaries. She wanted this messy, complicated, unconventional family they'd accidentally created. "That's kind," she said slowly, "but I don't think that's the solution." Caleb frowned. "Then what do you suggest? Because I won't have people saying things about you that aren't true. I won't have your reputation destroyed because you had the misfortune of needing help." Maribel took a deep breath, hardly believing what she was about to propose. "What if we made the arrangement even more proper? What if we got married?" The silence that followed was deafening. Caleb stared at her as if she'd suggested they fly to the moon. Eli's eyes went wide as saucers. "Married," Caleb repeated slowly. "A marriage of convenience," Maribel clarified quickly. "Purely practical. You need someone to help with Eli in the house. I need legal protection and a place to stay. Marriage would solve both problems and silence any gossip." She was speaking fast now, trying to convince herself as much as him. "We could maintain separate rooms, live as friends, and business partners. Nothing would have to change except the legal status." "You want to marry me," Caleb said, still sounding stunned. "After you just escaped being forced to marry someone else, your solution is to marry me instead?" Put that way, it did sound insane. But Maribel had learned to trust her instincts about people, and everything in her insisted that Caleb Turner was nothing like Miles Dandridge. Where Miles had been false charm and hidden cruelty, Caleb was rough honesty and hidden kindness. Where Miles had tried to control and possess, Caleb had offered freedom and respect.
"Yes," she said simply. "I want to marry you, if you'll have me." "You'd really be my mama?" Eli asked, his voice trembling with hope. "For real? And forever?" "For real and forever," Maribel confirmed, then looked back at Caleb. "But only if your father agrees. This would be his decision as much as mine." Caleb stood abruptly and walked to the window, staring out at the prairie. Maribel watched his shoulders rise and fall with deep breath, watched him struggle with something she couldn't see. When he finally turned back, his expression was raw and vulnerable. "I loved Sarah," he said quietly. "Loved her with everything I had. When she died, I thought that was it for me. One great love in a lifetime, and then just existence afterward. I never thought about marrying again, never wanted to. And now you're suggesting we marry for convenience, for protection, for practical reasons." He paused.
"Doesn't that seem wrong somehow? Doesn't that dishonor what marriage is supposed to be?"
"I don't know what marriage is supposed to be," Maribel admitted. "I only know what it could be for us. A partnership between two people who respect each other, who need each other, who've both learned that life doesn't give you perfect solutions. You loved Sarah, and that's beautiful. I would never ask you to forget that or replace that. But maybe what we build could be different. Not less than what you had, just different." Caleb studied her for a long moment, and Maribel forced herself to meet his gaze steadily, to let him see her sincerity and her fear and her desperate hope all tangled together. "You'd be all right with a marriage without love?" he asked finally. Would she? Maribel had never been in love, had never had the luxury of romance or courtship. She'd spent her life being practical, making hard choices, settling for what she could get rather than what she wanted. The idea of a marriage without love should have seemed perfectly acceptable. But looking at Caleb Turner with his dark, honest eyes and his quiet strength, at Eli with his desperate need for a mother, at the life they could build together in this harsh, beautiful place, she realized she was already halfway to loving them both. Not romantic love, perhaps, but something just as real. Something that felt like coming home after a lifetime of wandering. "I'd be all right with it," she said, "because I think maybe we'd have something better than love. We'd have honesty and respect and real partnership. We'd have a foundation built on truth instead of pretty lies." Caleb looked at his son, who was watching them both with an expression of almost painful hope. Then he looked back at Maribel, and she saw the moment he made his decision. "All right," he said, "if you're sure, if you're really sure this is what you want, then yes, I'll marry you." Eli let out a whoop of joy and launched himself at both of them, wrapping his arms around their waists and squeezing tight. Maribel felt tears pricking her eyes, tears of relief and exhaustion and something that might have been joy.
She was going to marry Caleb Turner, not because she was desperate and alone with nowhere else to go, though that was part of it. Not because she was running from Miles Dandridge, though that was true too. But because in the space of less than 2 weeks, this rough cowboy and his grieving son had given her something she'd never had before. They'd given her a reason to stay. They were married 3 days later in the small church at Red Butte, with half the town in attendance and the other half gossiping about it from their front porches. Maribel wore her best dress, the blue cotton she'd arrived in, freshly washed and pressed, and carried a bouquet of prairie wildflowers that Eli had picked that morning. Caleb wore a clean shirt and his Sunday best, his hair slicked back with water, his hands scrubbed raw from nervous washing. Reverend Matthews performed the ceremony with a knowing look in his eyes that suggested he understood exactly what kind of marriage this was. Not a love match, but a practical arrangement between two people who needed each other. He kept the service brief and dignified, asking the traditional questions but skipping the more romantic flourishes that would have felt like lies. Do you, Caleb Turner, take Maribel Hayes to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward? I do, Caleb said, his voice steady and sure. And do you, Maribel Hayes, take Caleb Turner to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward? Maribel looked at the man standing beside her, this stranger who'd become her employer, her protector, and now her husband in the space of 2 weeks. She thought about all the ways this could go wrong, all the reasons this was a terrible idea. Then she thought about Eli standing behind them, practically vibrating with excitement. She thought about the life she'd left behind in Philadelphia, and the life she could build here if she was brave enough to reach for it. I do, she said clearly. There were no rings to exchange. Neither of them had such love. Instead, Caleb took her hand in his calloused palm warm and solid against hers, and the Reverend pronounced them husband and wife. The congregation applauded politely, though Maribel could see some of the women whispering behind their hands, already spinning this into the story they'd tell at quilting circles and market days. The reception was held at the Turner Ranch, with Mrs. Jameson and several other churchwomen bringing food and setting up tables in the yard. It was a modest affair. No fancy cake or champagne, just coffee and simple food and neighbors who'd come partly out of genuine goodwill and partly out of curiosity to see how this strange marriage would play out. Sheriff Bradshaw attended, taking Caleb aside at one point to update him on Miles Dandridge's situation. Maribel couldn't hear their conversation, but she saw Caleb's expression darken and knew the news wasn't entirely good. Later, when most of the guests had departed and Eli was helping the remaining women clean up, Caleb found Maribel standing alone on her porch, watching the sun sink toward the horizon. The sheriff says Dandridge's lawyer is already working on getting him released on bail, Caleb said without preamble. Claims he's not a flight risk and that the charges are exaggerated. Maribel's stomach clenched, but she kept her voice steady. Will they grant it? Bradshaw thinks they might. Dandridge has connections, money to throw around. He could be out within the week. Caleb leaned against the porch railing beside her. But there's more. The sheriff's been digging into those other women I mentioned, the ones Dandridge defrauded. He's found 3 of them so far, and all 3 are willing to testify. With your testimony added to theirs, we might actually have enough to put him away for a long time. Might, Maribel repeated. Not will. Trials are unpredictable. You know that. Caleb turned to look at her, his dark eyes serious. If you've changed your mind about testifying, if you want to just disappear and start over somewhere else, I'd understand. Hell, I'd help you do it. I could give you money, arrange passage to California or Oregon. Stop, Maribel interrupted. I'm not running. We've been through this. That was before you were legally tied to me, before you took my name, before... He gestured helplessly at the ranch, the house, the life they'd just committed to building together. Before all this, if Dandridge comes after you again, he'll come after my family now, my son. I won't risk Eli getting caught in the crossfire. Then we protect him, Maribel said firmly. Together. That's what marriage means, isn't it? Facing things together instead of running away alone? Caleb studied her face for a long moment, as if trying to memorize her features. You're the bravest person I've ever met. You know that. Braver than any soldier, any cowboy. Sarah was brave too, but in a different way. She was brave in the way women are when they make a home in a hard place and raise children and keep going day after day. But you're brave in the way warriors are, the kind that doesn't back down even when backing down would be smarter. The comparison to Sarah should have made Maribel uncomfortable, but instead she felt honored. She knew Caleb wasn't trying to replace his first wife with her, wasn't trying to pretend they were the same. He was simply acknowledging that there were different kinds of strength, different ways of being brave. Sarah would have liked you, Caleb continued quietly. She always said the world needed more women who refused to be pushed around, more women who stood up and fought back. I wish I could have known her, Maribel said honestly. From everything I've heard, she was remarkable. She was, and so are you, just in different ways. Caleb straightened, his expression becoming businesslike, as if the emotional conversation had made him uncomfortable. Speaking of which, we should probably discuss the sleeping arrangements. I meant what I said about building you a separate cabin if you want one, but for now, you can keep the spare room. I'll stay in my room, Eli in his. We'll maintain separate spaces. Very proper, Maribel agreed, though something in her chest felt oddly disappointed, which was ridiculous. This was exactly the arrangement they'd agreed to. A marriage of convenience, nothing more. Should we establish other rules about how we'll manage the household? How we'll make decisions? I suppose we should, though I'm not much good at rules and formality. On the ranch, I'm used to just doing what needs doing without a lot of planning. Then maybe we keep it simple. We both contribute what we can. You handle the ranch work, I handle the house, and Eli's care. We make major decisions together. We respect each other's privacy, and we're honest with each other, even when honesty is uncomfortable. Especially when it's uncomfortable, Caleb amended. I won't have lies between us, Maribel. I've had enough of lies and secrets to last a lifetime. They shook hands solemnly, sealing their business-like agreement, and Maribel tried to ignore how warm his hand felt in hers, how the simple touch sent unexpected warmth through her body. This was a practical arrangement, she reminded herself sternly. She could not afford to complicate it with feelings that weren't supposed to be part of the bargain. The next 2 weeks fell into a new rhythm, similar to before but subtly different now that Maribel carried Caleb's name. She was Mrs. Turner now, a respectable married woman instead of a questionable housekeeper. The change in how people treated her was immediate and stark. Women who'd looked at her with suspicion now greeted her warmly at church. Men who'd been overly familiar now kept a respectful distance. Even Mrs. Jameson, who'd softened toward Maribel before the wedding, now treated her as a genuine member of the community rather than a temporary interloper. But the change went deeper than social acceptance. Eli started calling her mama naturally, without the painful hesitation he'd shown before. Caleb consulted her on ranch decisions, asking her opinion on which calves to sell and whether they should plant winter wheat in the North Field. They worked together with increasing ease, anticipating each other's needs, falling into patterns of cooperation that felt almost choreographed. And at night, alone in her room, Maribel lay awake listening to the sounds of the house and wondering what it would be like if this marriage were real in every sense. She'd catch herself watching Caleb during meals, noticing the way his hands moved when he talked, the rare smile that transformed his serious face, the gentleness he showed Eli despite his rough exterior. She'd imagine what it would feel like to have those hands touch her, not in casual passing, but with intention, with desire, with the intimacy that husbands and wives were supposed to share. Then she'd remind herself that such thoughts were dangerous and foolish. Caleb had loved Sarah completely, and Maribel was just a convenient solution to his practical problem. She should be grateful for what she had: safety, security, purpose, belonging, instead of yearning for something that was never part of their agreement. The summons came on a Tuesday morning, delivered by a nervous young clerk from the territorial courthouse. Miles Dandridge's trial was scheduled to begin in 2 weeks, and Maribel's presence was required as a witness for the prosecution. The letter was formal and impersonal, but Maribel could read between the lines. This was her chance to tell her story publicly, to help ensure Miles faced justice for his crime. It was also her chance to be publicly humiliated, called a liar, have her character torn apart by Miles's expensive lawyers. She'd heard enough about courtroom trials to know what defense attorneys did to women who testified against powerful men. They'd suggest she was vindictive, opportunistic, a scorned woman seeking revenge. They'd imply she'd willingly entered into the arrangement and only cried foul when it didn't work out as planned. They'd make her look like the villain of the story while Miles played the wrong gentleman. "We'll face it together," Caleb said when she showed him the letter. "I'll come with you to the trial, testify about what I saw. Sheriff Bradshaw will testify too. And those other women, they'll tell their stories. You won't be alone in this." "But I'll be the main witness, the one they focus on." Maribel set the letter down carefully, as if it might explode if handled roughly. "Miles's lawyer will try to destroy my credibility. He'll bring up my past, my poverty, the fact that I worked in a boarding house. He'll make it sound sordid and shameful." "Let him try," Caleb said, and there was steel in his voice. "Anyone who knows you knows your character. Anyone with eyes can see you're a decent, honest woman who's had a hard life but never lost her dignity. If Miles's lawyer wants to attack that, he'll find himself facing the anger of every woman in this territory who's ever been judged unfairly for circumstances beyond her control." Maribel wanted to believe it, wanted to think that truth and justice would prevail. But she'd lived too long in the real world to have such faith. The powerful almost always won. Men like Miles Dandridge almost always got away with their crimes because they had money and connections and lawyers who knew how to twist the law to their advantage. But she'd stand up anyway. She'd tell her truth anyway. Because the alternative, letting Miles hurt other women, letting him continue his fraudulent schemes, was unacceptable. The 2 weeks before the trial passed in a blur of preparation. The prosecutor, a serious young man named James Whitmore, came to the ranch 3 times to go over Maribel's testimony, asking her detailed questions about every interaction with Miles, every letter he'd sent, every promise he'd made. He was thorough and professional, but Maribel could see the doubt in his eyes. He didn't think they could win. "Dandridge's lawyer is Albert Cunningham," Whitmore explained during their final meeting. "He's one of the best defense attorneys in the territory. Expensive, ruthless, and very good at making witnesses look unreliable. He'll attack your credibility, Mrs. Turner. He'll try to make the jury believe you're a gold digger who targeted Mr. Dandridge, and then, when he rejected you, you sought revenge by inventing charges against him." "But I didn't target him. He advertised for a bride," I responded. "He's the one who initiated everything." "I know that. You know that. But Cunningham will suggest you misrepresented yourself in your letters, that you lied about your circumstances to make yourself more appealing, that you were essentially trying to defraud Mr. Dandridge. Then, when he discovered your deception and refused to marry you, you concocted this entire story to punish him." The injustice of it made Maribel's blood boil. "So no matter what I say, no matter what the truth is, he'll find a way to make me look like the villain?" "He'll try," Whitmore confirmed. "That's why we need to be prepared. We need you to stay calm, answer questions directly. Don't get defensive or emotional. The moment you lose your temper or start crying, Cunningham will use it against you. He'll say you're unstable, overly emotional, unreliable. In other words, be perfect," Maribel said bitterly. "Don't show any human reaction to being called a liar and a whore in front of a courtroom full of strangers." Whitmore had the grace to look uncomfortable. "I know it's not fair, but that's the reality of trials like this. The victim is often put on trial along with the accused." After he left, Maribel stood on the porch and stared at the prairie, feeling the weight of what was coming settle over her like a physical burden. She'd thought escaping Miles at the train station was the end of her ordeal. Instead, it had just been the beginning. Caleb found her there an hour later, still standing in the same spot, lost in dark thoughts. "You don't have to do this," he said quietly. "I know I said you should testify, but if it's too much, if it's going to hurt you more than it'll help, we can find another way." "What other way? Let Miles go free? Let him hurt other women? We could leave, take Eli, go to California or Oregon. Start over somewhere Miles Dandridge's reach doesn't extend. I've got some money saved. Not much, but enough to get us settled somewhere new." The offer was tempting. God, it was so tempting. To just run away from all of this. To start fresh in a place where no one knew her story or judged her choices. To build a life with Caleb and Eli somewhere clean and new. But running would mean Miles won. It would mean all those other women got no justice. It would mean teaching Eli that when things got hard, the solution was to flee instead of fight. "No," Maribel said firmly. I'm seeing this through. I'll go to that courthouse, I'll sit in that witness chair, and I'll tell the truth. Whatever happens after that, at least I'll know I didn't run. Caleb moved to stand beside her, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. You're sure? I'm terrified, she admitted, but I'm sure. He reached out and took her hand, not a casual touch, but a deliberate gesture of support and solidarity. His palm was warm and rough against hers, and Maribel felt something shift between them, some invisible boundary being crossed. Then I'll be there with you, Caleb said. Every minute of that trial. You won't face it alone. The trial began on a cold Monday morning in late September. The courthouse was packed with spectators, people from Red Butte and surrounding areas, all eager to witness the downfall of Miles Dandridge, or more likely, the spectacle of a woman being torn apart on the witness stand. Maribel walked into that courtroom with her head high and her hand in Caleb's, refusing to show the fear churning in her stomach. Miles sat at the defense table looking smug and confident, dressed in an expensive suit and radiating the kind of entitled arrogance that came from never facing real consequences. When his eyes met Maribel's, he smiled, a slow, cruel expression that promised she'd regret crossing him. Beside him, Albert Cunningham looked every bit as dangerous as his reputation suggested. He was a large man with silver hair and sharp eyes, expensively dressed, and carrying himself with the kind of confidence that came from winning far more cases than he lost. The prosecution's case took 2 days to present. They called Sheriff Bradshaw first, who testified about the arrest, the forged court documents, the evidence found at Miles's property. Then came the other women, 3 of them, each telling stories that were sickeningly similar to Maribel. Miles had advertised for brides, extracted money from them under various pretenses, then either abandoned them or made their lives so miserable they fled. One woman had been physically beaten. Another had been locked in a room for 3 days when she threatened to report him to the authorities. Their testimonies were powerful and damning, but Cunningham cross-examined them with brutal efficiency. He found inconsistencies in their stories, suggested they were lying to get revenge on a man who rejected them, implied they were women of questionable morals looking for easy money. By the time he was done with each of them, their credibility had been shredded, and the jury looked skeptical. Then it was Maribel's turn. She walked to the witness stand on trembling legs, placed her hand on the Bible, and swore to tell the truth. Prosecutor Whitmore took her through her story step by step. The advertisement, the letters, her journey from Philadelphia, Miles's failure to meet her at the station, Caleb's offer of employment, Miles's return and his threats, the attempted kidnapping, the forged court order. Maribel kept her voice steady and her answers clear, just as Whitmore had coached her. She didn't embellish or dramatize. She simply told what had happened as honestly and directly as she could. Then Cunningham stood for cross-examination, and Maribel steeled herself for the attack she knew was coming. Mrs. Turner, he began, his voice smooth and patronizing. Or should I say Miss Hayes? I confess I'm a bit confused about which name to use, given how quickly you transitioned from one intended husband to another. My legal name is Maribel Turner, she said evenly. I married Caleb Turner after your client attempted to kidnap me. How convenient and how romantic. Swept off your feet by your employer mere days after arriving in Wyoming. Tell me, had you planned that from the beginning? Did you see an opportunity in Mr. Turner's grief and decide to take advantage of it? No, Maribel said finally. I had no plan except to survive. Mr. Turner offered me honest employment, nothing more. Honest employment, Cunningham repeated mockingly. Living in his house, caring for his child, playing the role of wife in all but name. And then when my client rightfully attempted to claim his promised bride, you suddenly decided to make it official with Mr. Turner. Very convenient timing, wouldn't you say? Your client tried to kidnap me with armed men. That's what prompted the marriage, the need for legal protection for him. Cunningham smiled, as if she'd walked into a trap. Ah yes, the alleged kidnapping. Tell me, Mrs. Turner, did you read the contract you signed with my client before traveling to Wyoming? I signed a letter agreeing to the marriage arrangement, yes. And in that letter, didn't you promise to fulfill the terms of the agreement? Didn't you commit legally and in writing to marry my client upon your arrival? I committed to marry him if he honored his promises. He didn't show up at the station as agreed. That violated the contract on his part. Or perhaps, Cunningham suggested, my client delayed his arrival for legitimate business reasons and found, upon returning, that his intended bride had already moved into another man's home and was living in a highly improper arrangement. Perhaps he had every right to insist you honor your commitment. He had no right to strike me, Maribel said, letting some of her anger show. He had no right to have his men put their hands on me. He had no right to forge legal documents. Ah, yes, the alleged forgery. Tell me, Mrs. Turner, are you an expert in legal documents? Can you definitively state that the paper my client presented was false? The sheriff confirmed it was forged. Judge Hackett was in Denver at the time. He couldn't have signed it. So you're relying on hearsay rather than personal knowledge. Interesting. Cunningham turned to address the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, what we have here is a young woman who came to Wyoming with nothing, no money, no prospects, no family. She saw an opportunity in Mr. Turner's grief and seized it. When my client attempted to hold her to her legal commitments, she cried assault and kidnapping, manufactured charges, and convinced local law enforcement to arrest an innocent man. And now she sits before you, safely married to a man of means, trying to destroy my client's reputation and freedom. That's not true, Maribel protested, but Cunningham talked over her. Tell me, Mrs. Turner, how much did you get paid for this testimony? What did the prosecutor promise you? What did Mr. Turner promise you? Nothing. I was paid nothing. I'm testifying because what happened was wrong. Or because you need to justify your own actions. Because you need to make yourself the victim instead of the opportunistic fraud you really are. That's enough, Judge Harrison interrupted, banging his gavel. Mr. Cunningham, you will address the witness with respect, or I will hold you in contempt. My apologies, Your Honor, Cunningham said smoothly, not sounding apologetic at all. I have no further questions for this witness. Maribel stepped down from the witness stand on shaking legs and walked back to where Caleb waited. He stood and pulled her into his arms immediately, right there in the courthouse. Propriety be damned. She buried her face in his shoulder and fought back tears of anger and humiliation. You did good, he whispered. You told the truth. That's all you could do. But as Maribel looked around the courtroom at the faces watching them, some sympathetic, some skeptical, some openly hostile, she wondered if truth was enough. Cunningham had done exactly what he'd promised to do. He'd made her look opportunistic, made her marriage to Caleb look suspicious, made everything she'd said sound like convenient lies designed to cover her own scheme. The trial continued for 3 more days. The prosecution brought in document experts who confirmed the court order was forged. They brought in the station master who testified that Miles had made no effort to meet Maribel's train. They built a solid case showing Miles's pattern of fraud and abuse. But Cunningham countered every point. He suggested the documents could have been forged by someone trying to frame his client. He brought character witnesses who testified to Miles's sterling reputation in the business community. He painted a picture of a successful businessman being destroyed by vengeful women who couldn't accept rejection. When closing arguments came, both lawyers made passionate speeches. Whitmore emphasized the courage of the women who testified, the clear evidence of Miles's crimes, the need to protect future victims. Cunningham focused on reasonable doubt, on the possibility that this was all an elaborate conspiracy by women with ulterior motives. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. Maribel spent those hours in a small room off the courthouse, pacing like a caged animal, while Caleb watched helplessly and Eli clung to her skirts. When the bailiff finally came to summon them back to the courtroom, Maribel's heart was pounding so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. The jury filed back in, their faces carefully neutral. Judge Harrison called for order, and the foreman stood to deliver the verdict. In the matter of the Territory versus Miles Dandridge, on the charge of assault, we find the defendant guilty. Maribel's knees went weak. Guilty. They'd believed her about the assault. On the charge of attempted kidnapping, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of forgery of legal documents, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of fraud, we find the defendant guilty. Guilty. Guilty on every count. The jury had seen through Cunningham's smoke and mirrors. They'd believed the women. They'd believed her. Miles's face went white, then red with rage. He surged to his feet, shouting something about corruption and injustice. But the bailiffs were already moving to restrain him. Cunningham tried to maintain his composure, already calling for appeal, but the damage was done. Miles Dandridge had been convicted. Judge Harrison banged his gavel for order, then addressed the defendant. Mr. Dandridge, you have been found guilty of serious crimes against multiple women. You used fraud and intimidation to prey on vulnerable people seeking honest new start. You forged legal documents and used violence to enforce your will. The court sentences you to 10 years in the territorial prison, with no possibility of parole for the first 5 years. 10 years. Maribel felt tears streaming down her face. Tears of relief, of vindication, of fierce joy that justice had actually prevailed for once. Caleb's arm came around her shoulders, and Eli pressed against her side. And for a moment they stood there in the courthouse surrounded by chaos, holding each other tight. Miles was being dragged from the courtroom, still shouting threats, his face twisted with hatred. As he passed their section, his eyes locked on Maribel's one final time. "This isn't over," he snarled. "I'll get out eventually. And when I do, when you do, you'll be an old man," Sheriff Bradshaw interrupted, peering beside them. "And these folks will still be here, living their lives, having forgotten you ever existed. That's the real punishment, Dandridge. Not the years in prison, but the fact that you'll be forgotten while they go on to build something real." The words hit Miles harder than any physical blow could have. His face crumpled, and then he was gone, dragged through the courthouse doors to the prison wagon waiting outside. In the aftermath of the trial, life at the Turner Ranch settled into something resembling normalcy. The notoriety faded as other scandals and stories captured the territory's attention. Maribel and Caleb fell back into their routines. Him working the ranch, her managing the house, both of them raising Eli together in the odd partnership their marriage had become. But something had changed during the trial. Some barrier had broken down when Caleb held her in the courthouse. When he'd stood beside her through every minute of her testimony, when he'd looked at her with such fierce pride after the verdict was read. They were still maintaining separate bedrooms, still operating under the terms of their practical arrangement, but the emotional distance they'd carefully maintained was eroding. Maribel would catch Caleb watching her sometimes, his expression unguarded, and she'd see something in his eyes that looked suspiciously like affection. More than affection, something deeper, warmer, more dangerous. And she knew her own expression probably showed the same thing when she looked at him. They were falling in love, slowly and inevitably, despite all their careful plans to keep this marriage purely practical. It came to a head one evening in late October. Eli had gone to bed early, exhausted from a day spent helping with the harvest. Maribel was washing dishes, and Caleb was sitting at the table supposedly reviewing ranch accounts, but mostly just watching her work. "Can I ask you something?" he said finally. "Of course. Are you happy? Here, I mean. With this life we've built?" Maribel set down the dish she'd been washing and turned to face him. "Yes," she said honestly. "Happier than I ever expected to be. Even though this isn't what you planned? Even though you're married to a man you barely know, living on a ranch in the middle of nowhere?" "Especially because of those things," Maribel said. "Everything I planned for myself fell apart, Caleb. Every dream I had crashed and burned. But what I found here, what we built together, is better than anything I could have planned." He stood and crossed to where she stood by the sink, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. "I think I'm falling in love with you," he said quietly. "I didn't plan to. Didn't think I could after Sarah. But somewhere between the train station and the courthouse, between all the meals and conversations and ordinary moments, I fell in love with my practical, convenient wife." Maribel's heart was pounding so hard she was sure he could hear it. "Caleb, you don't have to say anything. I know this wasn't part of our agreement. I know you married me for protection and stability, not for romance. I just wanted you to know that for me, this stopped being a convenient arrangement a long time ago." "You think I don't feel the same?" Maribel asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "You think I haven't been falling in love with you too? With the way you care for Eli, the way you work yourself to exhaustion every day, the way you stood beside me in that courthouse like you'd fight the whole world to protect me." Hope flared in Caleb's dark eyes. "You love me?" "I love you," she confirmed. "I didn't mean to. I tried not to, but I do." He reached up and cupped her face in his rough, scarred hands, the hands of a man who built things and fixed things and made a life from harsh land. "Can I kiss you?" he asked. "I've wanted to for weeks now, but I didn't want to push, didn't want to make you uncomfortable." In answer, Maribel rose on her toes and pressed her lips to his. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, as if they were both afraid of breaking this fragile new thing between them. Then Caleb's arms came around her, pulling her close, and the kiss deepened into something hungry and desperate, and full of all the longing they'd both been suppressing. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Caleb rested his forehead against hers. "I don't want separate rooms anymore," he said. "I don't want a marriage of convenience. I want a real marriage with you, a real partnership, real love." "Yes," Maribel breathed. "Yes to all of it." That night, Maribel moved her belongings into Caleb's room, into their room. They made love slowly and carefully, learning each other's bodies with the tenderness of people who'd been given an unexpected second chance at happiness. And afterward, lying in Caleb's arms, listening to the prairie wind whistle around the house, Maribel felt something she hadn't felt since her mother died. She felt like she'd come home. The winter that followed was harsh, with snow piling high around the ranch and temperatures dropping so low that water froze in the well. But inside the Turner house, there was warmth and laughter, and the kind of love that made hardship bearable. Maribel cooked and cleaned and cared for Eli, but now she also sat with Caleb in the evenings, her head on his shoulder, planning for the future they'd build together. They talked about expanding the ranch, about giving Eli siblings eventually, about growing old together in this harsh, beautiful place. Eli bloomed under the love of two parents who'd chosen to be a family. His nightmares faded. His laughter came more easily. He started talking about his mama Sarah without the devastating grief that had marked those conversations before, able to remember her with love instead of only loss. One evening in early spring, as they sat around the dinner table, Eli looked at Maribel seriously and said, "You know you're my mama now, right? Not just pretend mama, real mama." Maribel's throat tightened with emotion. "I know, sweetheart, and you're my real son. Not by birth, but by choice. And that's just as real. Papa says love is stronger when you choose it instead of just getting born into it," Eli continued. "He says you and him chose to love each other, and that's special." "Your papa's a very wise man," Maribel said, meeting Caleb's eyes across the table and seeing her own happiness reflected back at her. "Does that mean I can have a baby brother or sister soon?" Eli asked hopefully. "Tommy Johnson's mama just had twins, and he says they're fun even though they cry a lot." Caleb nearly choked on his coffee, and Maribel felt her face heat with a blush. But she couldn't help laughing at Eli's innocent enthusiasm. "We'll see," she said. The same answer mothers had been giving curious children since the beginning of time. "But whether you get siblings or not, you're stuck with your papa and me forever. We're a family now, and nothing's going to change that." Eli grinned, satisfied with that answer, and went back to eating his dinner. Over his head, Caleb reached across the table and took Maribel's hand, squeezing gently. She squeezed back, overwhelmed with gratitude for this life she'd stumbled into, this family she'd found by accident. She'd come to Wyoming as a mail-order bride with nothing but a battered suitcase and broken dreams. She'd been abandoned at a train station, attacked by the man who'd promised to marry her, forced to testify in a humiliating trial. She'd faced dangers and hardships she never could have imagined in her Philadelphia boarding house. But she'd also found Caleb Turner and his grieving son. She'd found courage she didn't know she possessed. She'd found a home in the vast Wyoming prairie. She'd found love in the last place she expected, not with the man she'd traveled 1,000 miles to marry, but with the cowboy who'd offered her shelter when she needed it most. The spring turned to summer and summer to fall. As the ranch prospered and Eli grew, and Maribel's belly began to swell with the baby they'd created together, she sometimes thought about that day on the train platform. About the woman she'd been. Desperate, frightened, alone. About how that woman had stepped off the train expecting one life and found a completely different one. She'd been broken when she arrived. They'd all been broken. Caleb by grief, Eli by loss, herself by years of hardship and disappointment. But somehow, three broken people had found each other and built something whole, something strong. something that could withstand Wyoming winters and courtroom battles and all the other challenges life would throw at them. On a cold December evening, exactly 1 year after Maribel had first arrived in Red Butte, she stood on the porch watching the sunset paint the prairie in shades of gold and amber. Caleb came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her thickened waist, and she leaned back against his solid warmth. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "About how I came here to marry a stranger and ended up finding a family," she said. "About how sometimes the worst things that happen to us lead to the best things." Miles Dandridge sitting in prison probably doesn't feel like the worst thing anymore, does it? No, Maribel agreed. Because if he'd been at that station, if he'd married me like he promised, I never would have found you, never would have found this. She placed her hands over his on her belly, feeling their child move beneath her palms. I trade every disappointment, every hardship, every moment of fear to end up exactly here.
I love you, Maribel Turner, Caleb said, his voice rough with emotion. I loved Sarah, and I always will. But I love you too, in a different way. You saved us, me and Eli both. You walked into our grief and refused to let us drown in it. You gave us a reason to keep living. You saved me too, Maribel reminded him. When you offered me that ride from the station, when you gave me work and shelter, when you stood beside me in that courthouse, you saved my life just as surely as I saved yours. They stood together in the gathering darkness, watching stars begin to appear in the vast Wyoming sky. From inside the house, they could hear Eli practicing his letters at the kitchen table, his young voice carefully sounding out words, the sound of home, of family, of the life they built from the ruins of their separate griefs. Maribel Hayes had boarded a train in Philadelphia as a desperate woman with nowhere else to go. She'd stepped off in Red Butte as an abandoned mail-order bride with no prospects and no hope. But she was leaving the porch tonight as Maribel Turner, wife, mother, and beloved member of a family who'd chosen her just as surely as she'd chosen them. And as Caleb led her back inside to warmth and light and the sound of their son's laughter, Maribel realized that sometimes the best love stories weren't the ones that went according to plan. Sometimes the best stories were the ones where everything fell apart, where you lost your way and found yourself in the last place you expected. Sometimes the best stories began with a boy running across a train platform, calling a stranger mama, with a cowboy who saw past desperation to the strength beneath, with a woman who learned to fight instead of run, to hope instead of hide, to love instead of merely survive. This was her story now, not the one she'd planned, but the one she'd earned, and it was more beautiful than anything she could have imagined.